Hey folks, tonight we're diving into something that'll make your worst nightmare look like a Disney movie. Medieval nightmare epidemics that literally spread through entire villages like ... Well, like a plague. But instead of boils and death, people were getting hit with the most bizarre, terrifying dreams you can imagine. Now, I know what you're thinking. How exactly does someone catch nightmares from their neighbor? Well, buckle up because medieval people figured out how to make even sleep a community activity and not the fun kind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious if you're listening at 2 a.m. like a proper insomniac, or if you're one of those absolute psychopaths who listens to sleep stories during lunch break. And don't worry if you drift off halfway through. That's kind of the point. Though honestly, some of these stories might keep you awake longer than you'd expect. Because here's the thing, when entire villages start having the same nightmares, when people literally dance themselves to death because of shared delusions, when your daily bread can make you hallucinate demons, well, that's not just history, that's a medieval horror movie that actually happened. We're talking about a time when people thought the best cure for uncontrollable dancing was ... door dancing. When a single woman's bad dreams could psychologically destroy an entire community. When monks were getting so high off their communion wine that they thought God was personally visiting their sleep. Tonight, we're exploring medieval nightmare epidemics, real outbreaks of shared terror that swept through communities like wildfire. Dreams don't just happen to you. Sometimes they happen through you and to everyone around you. Let's start with probably the most absolutely insane medieval epidemic ever recorded, the dancing plague of 1518. And when I say insane, I mean this is the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about human behavior, mass psychology, and just how weird history can get when people lose their collective minds. Picture this, it's July 14th, 1580 in Strasbourg, which at the time was part of the Holy Roman Empire, not France like it is today. The summer heat is already brutal, the kind that makes you want to stay indoors and complain about everything. But Frau Trafia, and yes, that was actually her name, though some sources call her Han Trafia, steps out of her narrow cobblestone street house and just starts dancing. Now, this wasn't some joyful, I'm so happy I could dance kind of dancing. This was violent, spasmodic, terrifying dancing. Her arms were flailing like she was being electrocuted, her legs were moving in these jerky, uncontrolled movements, and her eyes, completely vacant, like someone had unplugged her consciousness and left her body running on some kind of demonic autopilot. The really unsettling part is that she didn't stop. Day 1, still dancing. Day 2, still dancing, now with blood pooling in her swollen feet. Day 3, 4, 5, this woman is literally dancing herself to death in front of the entire neighborhood. And everyone's just watching. Because what do you even do with that? How do you intervene when someone seems physically incapable of stopping their own movements? By day 6, Frau Trafia had been dancing non-stop for nearly a week. No food, no real sleep, just this constant, violent movement that was destroying her body from the inside out. Her feet were bleeding into her shoes, her clothes were soaked with sweat, and she was making these horrible cries for help between the convulsions. Imagine being trapped inside your own body, watching it perform this horrific dance while you're screaming internally for it to stop. But here's where the story goes from disturbing to absolutely apocalyptic. People started joining her. Not because they wanted to, not because they were inspired by her dancing, but because they literally couldn't help themselves. It started with just a few people. By the end of the first week, there were over 30 people dancing in the streets of Strasbourg. By August, we're talking about 400 people caught in the same violent, uncontrollable dance. Think about that number for a second, 400 people. In a medieval city, that wasn't just a crowd, that was a significant portion of the entire population. Imagine walking through your neighborhood and seeing 400 people engaged in this terrifying, zombie-like dance, unable to stop, crying for help, bleeding from their feet, collapsing from exhaustion only to get back up and continue dancing. The symptoms were consistent across all the victims, which is what makes this so genuinely disturbing. They all described the same spasmodic movements, the same violent arm thrashing, the same vacant, expressionless eyes. Their bodies would be drenched in sweat within minutes, and they would dance until they literally collapsed from exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. But even when they collapsed, many would continue making dancing motions while lying on the ground, as if their bodies had forgotten how to do anything else. The medical observers of the time, and yes, there were doctors studying this phenomenon as it happened, noted that the dancers' movements weren't random. There was a pattern to the madness, a choreography that seemed to be shared across all the victims. They would spin in similar ways, jump with similar timing, and their arm movements followed recognizable sequences. It was like they were all dancing to the same invisible music, following the same demonic choreographer. Now, you'd think the city officials would have some kind of emergency response plan for sudden outbreak of uncontrollable dancing, right? Wrong. These medieval bureaucrats looked at 400 people literally dancing themselves to death and thought, you know what this situation needs? More dancing. I'm not kidding. The City Council of Strasbourg hired musicians, built stages, and brought in professional dancers, convinced that if people just danced enough, they'd get it out of their system. It's like treating a fire with gasoline or trying to cure someone's drinking problem by opening a brewery in their living room. The medieval equivalent of, have you tried turning it off and on again? Except instead of fixing the problem, it made everything exponentially worse. The musicians played louder, the stages got bigger, and more people joined the dancing epidemic. What had started as one woman's inexplicable breakdown had turned into a citywide catastrophe, with professional entertainers essentially acting as amplifiers for whatever psychological contagion was spreading through the population. But here's where the story gets truly bizarre, and this is the part that'll keep. You awake at night, the dancers were having shared visions while they danced. They weren't just moving uncontrollably, they were experiencing collective hallucinations. Multiple witnesses reported that the dancers would call out to saints, argue with invisible demons, and respond to commands that only they could hear. It was like they had collectively entered some kind of waking nightmare state, where the boundary between reality and hallucination had completely dissolved. Some dancers claimed they could see Saint Vitus, the patron saint associated with dancing disorders, commanding them to continue. Others reported being chased by demons that only they could see, demons that would only leave them alone if they kept dancing. The most disturbing accounts described dancers having conversations with deceased relatives, following the ghosts of dead loved ones in an eternal, torturous dance. The shared nature of these visions is what elevates this from a simple case of mass hysteria to something far more unsettling. We're not talking about individual delusions here. We're talking about a collective break from reality where hundreds of people simultaneously experience the same supernatural encounters while their bodies perform the same uncontrollable movements. The physical toll was devastating. Contemporary medical accounts describe dancers whose feet had swollen to twice their normal size, with blood seeping through their shoes and creating puddles on the cobblestones. Their hands would be raw from constant motion, their throats would be damaged from constant screaming, and their bodies would be covered in bruises from repeatedly falling and getting back up to continue dancing. At the height of the epidemic, witnesses reported that as many as 15 people were dying every single day. Some died from heart attacks brought on by the constant physical exertion. Others died from strokes caused by the extreme physical and psychological stress. Many simply died from exhaustion, their bodies finally giving out after days or weeks of non-stop movement. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of these deaths was that they weren't peaceful. Witnesses described dancers who continued their movements even as they were dying, their bodies still twitching and gyrating even as their hearts stopped beating. It was as if the dancing had become so deeply embedded in their nervous systems that even death couldn't immediately stop the movement. The families of the affected were left in complete helplessness. Imagine watching your spouse, your children, your parents caught in this horrific dance, unable to eat, unable to rest, slowly dying in front of your eyes while you're powerless to help them. Some families tried restraining their loved ones, but the dancers would become violent when prevented from moving, as if stopping the dance was more terrifying than continuing it. The economic impact on Strasbourg was catastrophic. Entire industries shut down because workers couldn't stop dancing. Markets closed because vendors were either affected themselves or too terrified to venture into the streets where hundreds of people were engaged in this apocalyptic dance. The city's normal rhythm of life completely collapsed, replaced by the constant sound of hundreds of feet pounding on cobblestones and the cries of people trapped in their own bodies. Religious leaders initially interpreted the epidemic as divine punishment for the city's sins. But when their prayers and exorcisms failed to stop the dancing, they became increasingly desperate. Some priests joined the city officials in encouraging more dancing, believing it was God's will. Others declared the dancers to be possessed by demons and tried to perform mass exorcisms, which only seemed to intensify the psychological terror experienced by the victims. The resolution of the dancing plague was almost as mysterious as its beginning. In early September, city officials finally abandoned their more dancing strategy and instead transported the most severely affected dancers to a shrine, dedicated to St. Vitus in the nearby mountains. Whether through divine intervention, the change of environment, or simple exhaustion of the psychological contagion, the dancing gradually stopped. But the ending wasn't clean or complete. Some dancers never fully recovered, continuing to experience periodic episodes of uncontrollable movement for months or even years afterward. Others were left with permanent physical disabilities from the weeks of constant, violent motion. And the psychological trauma affected not just the dancers but the entire community, which had witnessed one of the most disturbing mass psychological events in human history. The most chilling aspect of the dancing plague of 1518 is that it wasn't unique. Similar outbreaks had been occurring throughout medieval Europe for centuries, and they would continue to occur for decades afterward. This wasn't a one-off event. It was part of a pattern of mass psychological epidemics that suggests something fundamental about human consciousness and social contagion that we still don't fully understand. When nightmares jump from the sleeping mind into waking reality, when individual psychological breakdown becomes collective catastrophe, when an entire city can lose its grip on reality simultaneously, that's when you realize that the medieval world was operating on psychological principles that modern science has barely begun to explore. The dancing plague of 1518 wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was a glimpse into the terrifying fragility of human consciousness itself. Now let me tell you about a knight who was literally being murdered in his sleep every single night for 30 years. Sir Stephen of Hoyland, and yes, that was his real name, which sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel, but was very much real life in 12th century England. This is a story that'll make you grateful for your worst insomnia, because at least when you can't sleep, you're not being systematically tortured by demons every time you close your eyes. Stephen wasn't just any random medieval knight. He was a landowner, a veteran of several military campaigns, a guy who'd faced down armed enemies on battlefields across Europe without breaking a sweat. This was a man who'd seen the worst that medieval warfare could offer: sieges, hand-to-hand combat, the kind of violence that would traumatize modern soldiers even with all our psychological support systems. But none of that prepared him for what would become a 3-decade war against his own sleep. It started innocuously enough, sometime around 1140, when Stephen was in his early 30s. He'd return from his daily duties, eat dinner with his household, maybe share some wine with his men-at-arms, and settle down for what should have been a normal night's rest. But the moment his consciousness began to fade, the moment he crossed that threshold between waking and sleeping, something would be waiting for him. At first, it was just a weight on his chest. You know that feeling when you're falling asleep and suddenly feel like something heavy is pressing down on you? Now imagine that sensation, but amplified by 1,000, and with the absolute certainty that this weight is malevolent, intelligent, and specifically targeting you. Stephen would feel this crushing pressure descend on his chest the instant he began to dream, as if something massive and invisible was slowly, deliberately trying to squeeze the life out of him. But this wasn't just sleep paralysis as we understand it today. Modern sleep paralysis typically lasts a few minutes, maybe up to an hour in extreme cases. Stephen's attacks would go on for what felt like hours every single night. He would lie there, fully conscious within his dream, but completely unable to move his physical body, while this crushing weight slowly intensified until he was convinced he was about to die from suffocation. The real horror, though, was that Stephen could see his attacker. Not just feel it, not just sense its presence, but actually see this thing that was trying to kill him night after night. He described it as a grotesque creature, roughly humanoid, but wrong in every possible way. Its skin was the color of old leather, stretched too tight over bones that jutted at impossible angles. Its face was a nightmare amalgamation of human and animal features, eyes that glowed with their own sickly light, teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, and a mouth that was always twisted in this horrible expression of malicious joy. What made the creature even more terrifying was its intelligence. This wasn't some mindless monster acting on instinct. It was clearly enjoying Stephen's suffering. It would lean down close to his face while crushing his chest, and Stephen could feel its breath, which he described as smelling like rotting meat and sulfur. The creature would whisper things to him in languages he didn't recognize, but somehow he understood that it was describing all the ways it was going to torture him, not just tonight, but every night for the rest of his life. The physical sensations were so intense that Stephen genuinely believed he was dying every single time. The crushing weight on his chest would gradually increase until he felt his ribs cracking, his lungs collapsing, his heart struggling to beat against the pressure. He would try to scream, try to call for help, but of course no sound would come out. He was completely trapped inside his own body, forced to experience what felt like a slow, agonizing death night after night. But here's where the story gets even more disturbing. Stephen discovered that the attacks followed a pattern. The demon, because that's what he was convinced it was, seemed to know exactly how much torture he could endure before his mind would snap completely. It would bring him right to the edge of death, right to the point where his sanity was about to break, and then it would ease up just enough to keep him alive and conscious. It was like the creature was conducting some kind of scientific experiment in psychological torture, calibrating its attacks to maximize Stephen's suffering while keeping him functional enough to experience it all again the next night. The sleep deprivation alone should have killed him. 30 years of being terrorized every time he tried to sleep. 30 years of waking up multiple times each night in absolute panic. 30 years of associating sleep with torture and death. By all medical logic, Stephen should have died from exhaustion within months. But somehow, he survived, which only reinforced his belief that this was supernatural in nature, that the demon was keeping him alive specifically to continue the torture. Stephen's solution was both practical and completely insane. He hired servants, not just one or two, but an entire team of people whose only job was to watch him sleep and wake him up the moment he showed signs of distress. These weren't just casual observers. They were trained sleep monitors who understood exactly what to look for. They would position themselves around his bed in shifts, watching for the specific physical signs that indicated the demon had arrived. The wake-up protocol was brutal but effective. The servants were instructed to literally grab Stephen by his hair and shake him violently awake the moment they saw his breathing change or his face contoured in terror. They wouldn't just nudge him gently or call his name. They would physically yank him back to consciousness, often leaving him with bruises and sometimes pulling out handfuls of hair in the process. Imagine being so terrified of your own dreams that you hire people to violently assault you awake every night. Think about the level of desperation that would drive someone to prefer being grabbed by the hair and shaken until their teeth rattled rather than experiencing whatever was waiting for them in sleep. That's some next-level medieval PTSD right there, the kind of psychological trauma that would break most people within weeks. But the financial cost was enormous. Stephen was essentially running a 24-hour security operation against his own unconscious mind. He had to pay salaries for multiple servants, provide them with food and accommodation, and maintain this system every single night for 3 decades. The expense was so significant that it began to impact his ability to maintain his lands and fulfill his feudal obligations. He was literally impoverishing himself to avoid being tortured in his dreams. The servants themselves were affected by the experience. Imagine having a job where you watch someone experience absolute terror every single night, where you have to witness a grown man, a hardened warrior, reduced to helpless panic on a regular basis. Several of Stephen's sleep watchers quit after just a few weeks, unable to handle the psychological stress of witnessing his nightly torment. Others developed their own sleep disorders, as if Stephen's nightmare was somehow contagious. Stephen also spent a fortune consulting every physician, priest, and wise woman in England. The medical establishment of the 12th century actually had a specific term for his condition, ephialtes, which was their diagnosis for what we would now call nightmare disorder or severe sleep paralysis. But their treatments were, let's call them, creative. Some physicians prescribed bloodletting, believing that Stephen's nightmares were caused by an excess of melancholic humors in his blood. Others recommended various herbal concoctions, including mixtures of herbs that were probably mildly hallucinogenic and definitely toxic. He tried sleeping in different positions, sleeping in different rooms, sleeping surrounded by religious artifacts, sleeping with various amulets and charms designed to ward off demonic attack. The religious interventions were particularly elaborate. Stephen had his bedroom blessed by bishops, had holy water sprinkled on his bed every night, and even had a priest perform a full exorcism of his sleeping quarters. When those failed, he tried sleeping in churches, believing that consecrated ground would protect him from demonic visitation. But the attacks continued regardless of location, leading him to conclude that the demon wasn't attached to a place, it was attached specifically to him. One of the most interesting aspects of Stephen's case is how well documented it became. Because he was a person of some social standing, and because his condition was so unusual and persistent, multiple chroniclers recorded his story. We have accounts from physicians who examined him, priests who tried to help him, and even some of the servants who watched over his sleep. This gives us an unusually detailed picture of how medieval people understood and tried to treat severe nightmare disorders. The chroniclers noted that Stephen's waking behavior began to change after years of nightly torment. He became increasingly paranoid during the day, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting the demon to appear even while he was awake. He developed elaborate rituals around bedtime, spending hours each night preparing for sleep as if he were preparing for battle. He would pray extensively, arrange religious symbols around his bed, and give detailed instructions to his servants about exactly when and how to wake him. But perhaps most disturbing was how Stephen began to blur the line between his dream experiences and waking reality. After decades of nightly encounters with the demon, he started claiming that he could sense its presence during the day. He would sometimes stop in the middle of conversations, insisting that he could smell the creature's distinctive odor or feel its breath on his neck. His friends and family began to worry that the constant sleep deprivation and psychological trauma were causing him to lose his grip on reality entirely. The resolution of Stephen's case is where the story becomes either deeply spiritual or deeply psychological, depending on your worldview. After 30 years of nightly torment, Stephen claimed that St. Thomas Becket appeared to him in a dream. Now, this is significant because Becket had only recently been martyred and canonized, making him a particularly powerful intercessor in the medieval Christian mindset. According to Stephen's account, Becket didn't just appear in his dream, he engaged in actual combat with the demon. Stephen described watching these two supernatural beings fight over his soul, with Becket wielding what appeared to be a flaming sword while the demon fought with its claws and teeth. The battle was so intense that Stephen could feel the heat from Becket's sword and smell the sulfur from the demon's wounds. The fight lasted what felt like hours, with both beings evenly matched in supernatural power. But eventually, Becket managed to wound the demon severely enough that it retreated, screaming curses and threats as it disappeared. Becket then turned to Stephen and told him that the demon was bound by divine law never to return, that Stephen's years of faithful prayer and resistance had finally earned him divine protection. Whether you believe in divine intervention or think Stephen finally found a way to psychologically process and overcome his trauma, the attacks stopped. After 30 years of nightly terror, Stephen began sleeping peacefully. The servants were dismissed, the elaborate bedtime rituals were abandoned. And for the first time in 3 decades, Stephen was able to close his eyes without fear. But the experience had permanently changed him. Even after the attacks ended, Stephen never slept alone again. He always kept at least one servant nearby, not to wake him from nightmares, but simply for the psychological comfort of knowing someone was watching over him. He also became deeply religious, spending much of his remaining years making pilgrimages to various shrines and donating money to religious causes, convinced that his deliverance had been miraculous. The most chilling aspect of Stephen's story is how it illustrates the complete helplessness that medieval people felt when confronted with psychological disorders. Without any understanding of brain chemistry, sleep cycles, or trauma responses, they could only interpret severe nightmare disorders as supernatural attacks. This interpretation, while scientifically incorrect, wasn't entirely wrong. Stephen was indeed being attacked, night after night, by something that wanted to destroy him. The fact that the attacker was his own traumatized psyche rather than an external demon doesn't make the experience any less real or terrifying. Stephen's case also highlights how medieval society dealt with mental health issues. Rather than dismissing his claims as madness, his community took his supernatural interpretation seriously and tried to help within their understanding of the world. The physicians, priests, and servants who worked with Stephen weren't just humoring a delusional patient. They genuinely believed he was under demonic attack and did everything in their power to help him fight it. When your nightmares are so intense that you need bodyguards for your sleep, when you're willing to bankrupt yourself to avoid dreaming, when you'd rather be physically assaulted awake than face whatever's waiting in your unconscious mind, you're not just dealing with bad dreams. You're dealing with a complete breakdown of the boundary between the conscious and unconscious mind. A psychological war that plays out in the most vulnerable moment of human experience, the transition from waking to sleeping. Stephen of Hoyland survived 30 years of nightly psychological warfare and lived to tell about it. But his story serves as a reminder that the medieval world was a place where nightmares had teeth, where dreams could kill, and where the greatest battles were often fought not on physical battlefields, but in the dark territories of the human mind. Here's where medieval nightmares get really twisted, really fucked up, and really terrifying, because sometimes the nightmares weren't coming from inside people's heads. Sometimes they were coming from their daily bread. See? Anthony's fire, or ergotism as we call it today, was basically medieval Russian roulette every single time you ate a meal. The ergot fungus that grew on rye grain didn't just make you sick, it turned your entire reality into a living nightmare that you couldn't wake up from because you were already awake. Picture this, you're a medieval peasant and your entire world revolves around bread. Not the nice, fluffy, preservative-filled bread we eat today. We're talking about dense, dark rye bread that's literally the difference between life and starvation. You wake up every morning, break your fast with this bread, have it again for your midday meal, and end your day with more of the same. It's not just food, it's survival itself, baked into loaves and stored in your cellar. But sometimes, when the weather conditions are just wrong, too much rain followed by warm, humid conditions, a fungus called Claviceps purpurea starts growing on the rye grain. This isn't just any fungus. This is nature's own LSD factory, producing compounds like lysergic acid amides and ergot, alkaloids that are chemically similar to some of the most powerful hallucinogens known to science. Except medieval people had no idea they were essentially microdosing psychedelic compounds every time they ate their daily bread. The onset was insidious, which made it even more terrifying. It didn't happen all at once. It built up slowly over days or weeks of eating contaminated grain. First, you might notice some tingling in your fingers and toes, maybe some mild nausea. Nothing too alarming. Medieval life was full of minor discomforts. But then the hallucinations would start creeping in around the edges of your vision. Maybe you'd catch glimpses of movement that weren't really there, or hear whispers that seemed to be coming from empty rooms. But as the ergot alkaloids accumulated in your system, the hallucinations became impossible to ignore. People would start seeing demons everywhere, not just vague shapes or shadows, but detailed, terrifying creatures that seemed as real as anything else in their world. They would watch their neighbors transform into monsters right before their eyes, see the ground split open to reveal hell itself. Witness angels and devils engaged in cosmic battles in the skies above their villages. The really fucked up part is that these weren't private hallucinations. When an entire community was eating grain from the same contaminated harvest, everyone was experiencing similar visions simultaneously. Imagine walking through your village and seeing dozens of people all pointing at the same empty space, all screaming about the same demons that only they could see. It was like a coordinated descent into madness, a shared break from reality that affected entire populations at once. The physical symptoms were just as horrifying as the psychological ones. The fire part of ST. Anthony's fire came from the intense, burning sensation that would start in people's extremities and gradually spread through their entire bodies. It felt like being burned alive from the inside out, but without any visible flames. People would claw at their skin trying to extinguish fires that existed only in their nerve endings, often tearing themselves bloody in the process. But the burning was just the beginning. As the ergot poisoning progressed, people's circulation would be severely compromised. Their fingers and toes would start turning black as gangrene set in, and these blackened extremities would literally fall off their bodies. We're talking about people watching their own fingers drop off like overripe fruit, all while experiencing hallucinations so vivid that they couldn't tell what was real anymore. The gangrene wasn't limited to fingers and toes. In severe cases, entire hands, feet, and even arms and legs would become gangrenous and have to be amputated, if the person was lucky enough to have access to someone willing and able to perform the amputation. Many people simply died from the infection as their extremities rotted away while they were still attached to their bodies. Now imagine experiencing all of this while simultaneously hallucinating demons and monsters. You're watching your own body parts fall off, feeling like you're being burned alive and seeing terrifying creatures that seem to be mocking your suffering. Your mind is simultaneously trying to process genuine physical trauma and completely fictional supernatural attacks. The line between what's happening to your body and what's happening in your hallucinations becomes completely meaningless. The medieval interpretation of these symptoms was, predictably, supernatural. When entire communities started experiencing shared visions of demons while their bodies literally fell apart, the obvious explanation was divine punishment or demonic attack. The fact that it often affected everyone in a village simultaneously only reinforced the belief that this was some kind of supernatural plague sent to punish the community for their sins. The religious response was both understandable and completely counterproductive. Churches would organize mass prayers, processions, and penances to appease whatever divine force was causing the suffering. But since the real cause was contaminated grain, these religious interventions did nothing to stop the poisoning. In fact, they often made things worse by gathering large numbers of affected people together, creating mass hallucination events where hundreds of people would experience shared visions simultaneously. One of the most well-documented outbreaks occurred in France in 994 CE, and the scale of the disaster is almost impossible to comprehend. Contemporary chroniclers, and these were educated monks who were trained to record events accurately, reported that between 20,000 and 0 people died from St. Anthony's fire in a single outbreak. That's not a village or even a city, that's an entire region's worth of people, all poisoned by their daily bread. The chroniclers' descriptions of the outbreak read like something out of a horror movie. They wrote about villages where every single resident was simultaneously experiencing terrifying hallucinations while their bodies fell apart from gangrene. They described people running through the streets, screaming about demons that only they could see, while their blackened limbs fell off behind them. They recorded instances of entire families dying together, not from the gangrene itself, but from the sheer psychological trauma of watching each other's bodies disintegrate while experiencing shared nightmares. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these outbreaks was how they affected children. Kids as young as 5 or 6 would be consuming the same contaminated bread as their parents, but their smaller bodies would be affected much more severely by the ergot compounds. Children would experience hallucinations that were often even more vivid and terrifying than those experienced by adults, seeing monsters and demons that were perfectly calibrated to their developing fears and anxieties. Medieval chroniclers recorded heartbreaking accounts of children begging their parents to protect them from monsters that only they could see, while simultaneously watching their own small fingers and toes turn black and fall off. Parents would be helpless to comfort their children because they were experiencing their own terrifying hallucinations and physical symptoms. Entire families would be trapped in shared nightmares, unable to help each other or even communicate effectively about what was happening to them. The social breakdown that accompanied these outbreaks was almost as devastating as the physical symptoms. When everyone in a community is simultaneously experiencing severe hallucinations, normal social structures completely collapse. People couldn't work, couldn't care for their families, couldn't maintain basic hygiene or food preparation. Villages that had functioned normally for centuries would descend into complete chaos within weeks of an ergotism outbreak. Trade and commerce would grind to a halt as merchants refused to enter affected areas. Neighboring communities would quarantine themselves, refusing to accept refugees from ergot-affected villages out of fear that the curse was contagious. The economic impact would ripple outward from the affected areas, destabilizing entire regions as agricultural production collapsed and trade networks were disrupted. The legal system also broke down during ergotism outbreaks. How do you maintain law and order when the people responsible for enforcing it are experiencing severe hallucinations? How do you conduct trials when witnesses can't distinguish between what they actually saw and what they hallucinated? Many communities simply suspended normal legal processes during outbreaks, creating periods of lawlessness that could last for months. But the most insidious aspect of ergotism was how it affected people's decision-making abilities. The ergot alkaloids didn't just cause hallucinations and physical symptoms, they also impaired judgment and impulse control. People would make irrational decisions based on their hallucinations, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. They might abandon their homes and families to chase after visions, or they might become violent in response to perceived threats that existed only in their minds. There are documented cases of people destroying their own property while trying to fight off hallucinated demons, or injuring their family members while attempting to protect them from monsters that only they could see. The combination of vivid hallucinations and impaired judgment created situations where people's attempts to respond rationally to their perceived reality would cause real harm to themselves and others. The seasonal nature of ergotism outbreaks made them even more terrifying from a medieval perspective. Ergot fungus thrives in specific weather conditions, typically a cold, wet spring followed by a warm, rainy summer. This meant that outbreaks would often occur in late summer or early fall, right when communities were harvesting and storing grain for the winter. A single contaminated harvest could poison an entire community for months, creating extended periods of mass hallucination and physical suffering. The timing also meant that ergotism outbreaks often coincided with other stressful events like harvest festivals, religious holidays, or seasonal migrations. Communities that should have been celebrating successful harvests instead found themselves dealing with mass poisoning events. The contrast between expectation and reality, between anticipated abundance and actual nightmare, intensified the psychological trauma of these outbreaks. Medieval physicians eventually began to recognize patterns in ergotism outbreaks, even though they didn't understand the underlying cause. They noticed that the conditions seemed to spread through communities that shared the same grain supplies, and they observed that changing people's diets could sometimes alleviate symptoms. Some physicians recommended that affected people stop eating bread entirely and switch to other foods, though this advice was often impractical for communities where bread was the primary source of calories. The monks of the Order of St. Anthony became particularly skilled at treating ergotism, though their methods were based more on careful observation than scientific understanding. They figured out that moving affected people away from their home communities and feeding them completely different foods could stop the progression of symptoms. They also developed techniques for amputating gangrenous limbs before the infection could spread, saving many lives through what was essentially medieval emergency medicine. The Order of St. Anthony established hospitals specifically for treating ergotism victims, creating some of the first specialized medical facilities in medieval Europe. These hospitals were often located in areas that weren't affected by ergot contamination, allowing them to provide clean food and water to patients while their bodies slowly processed the accumulated toxins. The monks' approach was surprisingly sophisticated. They understood that this was a medical condition that required specific treatments, not just a spiritual problem that could be solved through prayer alone. But even the monks couldn't fully treat the psychological trauma caused by extended ergotism experiences. People who survived severe ergot poisoning were often left with permanent mental health issues, including chronic anxiety, depression, and recurring nightmares about the hallucinations they had experienced. Many survivors reported that they could never again eat bread without experiencing flashbacks to their ergotism episodes, creating lasting food aversions that could persist for years. The social stigma associated with ergotism was also significant. Communities that had experienced major outbreaks were often viewed with suspicion by their neighbors, who wondered if the curse might return or spread. Survivors sometimes faced discrimination or exclusion, as if they were still contaminated by whatever supernatural force had caused their suffering. This social isolation often compounded the psychological trauma, creating lasting mental health impacts that extended far beyond the physical symptoms. The most chilling aspect of ergotism is how it demonstrates the terrifying fragility of medieval life. A slight change in weather patterns, a bit of extra moisture during grain storage, a few spores of the wrong fungus. Any of these tiny factors could transform a community's basic food supply into a psychoactive nightmare fuel. People could go to bed normal and wake up in a world where their daily bread had literally become poisonous, where eating was a gateway to madness. When your food supply becomes unreliable not just as nutrition but as a source of sanity, when your daily bread can transform into a hallucinogenic nightmare without any warning, when entire communities can be simultaneously poisoned by the very substance that keeps them alive, that's when you realize that medieval life was a constant balancing act on the edge of catastrophe. The legacy of St. Anthony's fire extends far beyond medieval Europe. Some historians suggest that ergotism outbreaks may have contributed to some of the most famous episodes of mass hysteria in history, including possibly the Salem witch trials. The psychological and social dynamics of ergotism, shared hallucinations, impaired judgment, community-wide breakdown of normal behavior match many of the patterns observed in other historical episodes of collective madness. But perhaps most importantly, ergotism reminds us that the line between sanity and madness, between reality and nightmare, can be incredibly thin. Medieval people weren't more superstitious or less rational than we are. They were responding rationally to genuinely inexplicable experiences. When your daily bread can literally make you hallucinate demons, when entire communities can share the same terrifying visions simultaneously, the supernatural becomes a perfectly reasonable explanation for what's happening to your world. Medieval sleepwalking wasn't just wandering around confused in your pajamas. It was full contact dreaming with weapons, armor, and a complete disregard for the fact that you were unconscious. We're talking about a sleep disorder that turned bedtime into an armed military exercise, where people would get up, fully equip themselves for battle, mount their horses, and go hunting or fighting while completely asleep. Imagine waking up to find your neighbor fully armored and chasing imaginary enemies through your village at 3 a.m., swinging a very real sword at very imaginary demons. The medieval aristocratic sleepwalking epidemic, because yes, it was primarily an aristocratic problem, represents one of the most bizarre intersections of social class, psychological trauma, and sleep disorders in human history. This wasn't random wandering. This was the wealthy elite of medieval society literally acting out their daytime occupations while unconscious, turning their bedchambers into staging areas for midnight military campaigns that existed only in their sleeping minds. Let's start with the most documented case, Sir Geoffroy de Montfort, a Norman knight who served under William the Conqueror and spent the better part of 20 years, conducting elaborate military campaigns while fast asleep. Geoffroy's sleepwalking episodes weren't simple wandering. They were full-scale reenactments of famous battles. complete with tactical planning, troop movements, and detailed combat maneuvers performed with whatever weapons and armor he could access during his unconscious state. His household servants learned to recognize the warning signs. Geoffroy would begin each sleepwalking episode by sitting up in bed and surveying his surroundings as if he were a general assessing a battlefield. His eyes would be open but completely vacant, looking through rather than at the people and objects around him. He would then begin issuing military commands in Norman French, addressing invisible lieutenants and organizing phantom troops for battles that had already been fought years earlier. The servants' protocol was both fascinating and terrifying. They had learned through trial and error that attempting to wake Geoffroy during these episodes could be extremely dangerous, not just because he was armed, but because sudden awakening during deep sleepwalking could apparently cause severe psychological trauma. Instead, they would carefully remove any weapons from his immediate vicinity while allowing him to continue his unconscious military exercises with less dangerous substitutes. But here's where it gets really interesting. Geoffroy's sleepwalking battles were historically accurate. He would recreate specific engagements from the Norman conquest with remarkable precision, including tactical details that even contemporary military historians found impressive. His unconscious mind seemed to have perfect recall of battles fought decades earlier, complete with terrain features, weather conditions, and strategic decisions that he reproduced with uncanny accuracy while completely asleep. The physical complexity of these episodes was staggering. Geoffroy would spend hours each night engaged in elaborate combat choreography, performing sword techniques, mounted combat maneuvers, and siege warfare tactics with a level of skill that matched or even exceeded his conscious abilities. His body seemed to retain all of his military training even when his conscious mind was completely offline, creating these surreal spectacles of unconscious martial artistry. Medieval physicians were absolutely fascinated by aristocratic sleepwalking because it seemed to challenge their understanding of how the mind worked during sleep. The prevailing medical theory was that during sleep, reason and sensation shut down completely while imagination remained active. But sleepwalkers like Geoffroy were clearly accessing complex memories and performing skilled activities that should have required conscious control. This suggested that the sleeping mind was far more sophisticated and organized than medieval medicine had previously understood. The social implications were enormous. When the nobility, the people responsible for military leadership and political decision-making, were literally losing control of their actions during sleep, it created genuine concerns about the stability of medieval society. What if a sleepwalking lord made important political decisions while unconscious? What if sleepwalking knights injured their own allies during midnight military exercises? These weren't just medical curiosities. They were potential threats to the entire feudal system. The phenomenon wasn't limited to military activities. Lady Eleanor of Aquitaine, not the famous queen, but a lesser-known noblewoman of the same name, was documented as performing elaborate courtly ceremonies while sleepwalking. She would rise from her bed, dress herself in formal court attire, and conduct detailed diplomatic negotiations with invisible foreign ambassadors. Her nocturnal diplomatic sessions were so sophisticated that observers who didn't know she was asleep would have assumed they were witnessing actual political meetings. Eleanor's case was particularly disturbing because her sleepwalking diplomacy sometimes contradicted her conscious political positions. While awake, she might be advocating for war with a neighboring kingdom, but while sleepwalking, she would negotiate detailed peace treaties with representatives of that same kingdom. Her household was never sure which Eleanor, the conscious or unconscious one, represented her true political intentions. The economic angle of aristocratic sleepwalking was equally bizarre. Lord William de Braose was known for conducting complex business transactions while asleep, negotiating land deals and trade agreements with imaginary merchants and nobles. His unconscious mind seemed to have perfect recall of property values, market conditions, and legal requirements, often producing business arrangements that were more profitable than his conscious negotiations. But William's sleepwalking business dealings created a unique legal problem. Were contracts negotiated while unconscious legally binding? Medieval law had no precedent for dealing with agreements made by people who were technically not mentally present during the negotiations. Some of William's most advantageous land acquisitions were challenged in court on the grounds that he had been asleep during the negotiations, creating legal battles that continued for decades after his death. The religious aspects of aristocratic sleepwalking were perhaps the most unsettling. Many noble sleepwalkers would perform elaborate religious ceremonies while unconscious, conducting private masses, delivering sermons, and even performing what appeared to be exorcisms. Sir Robert de Beaumont was documented as celebrating full Catholic masses in his private chapel while completely asleep, including precise Latin recitations and ceremonial movements that would have required years of theological training. The church was deeply uncomfortable with unconscious religious performances. If someone could deliver theologically sophisticated sermons while asleep, what did that say about the role of conscious faith in religious practice? Were the sleepwalkers channeling divine inspiration? Or were they demonstrating that religious ceremony was simply learned behavior that could be performed without conscious spiritual engagement? The most disturbing case involved Baron Hugo de Lusignan, whose sleepwalking episodes included what appeared to be demonic possession rituals. While unconscious, Hugo would speak in languages he had never learned, perform complex magical ceremonies, and engage in detailed conversations with invisible supernatural entities. His household was convinced that his sleeping mind was somehow more susceptible to demonic influence than his conscious awareness. Hugo's case was particularly troubling because his sleepwalking supernatural activities were often more sophisticated than the exorcism techniques used by trained priests. He would perform elaborate banishment rituals, using ceremonial procedures that contemporary religious scholars couldn't identify, suggesting that his unconscious mind had access to occult knowledge that wasn't available to his conscious awareness. The medical explanations were surprisingly sophisticated for the time. Medieval physicians correctly identified that sleepwalking occurred during specific phases of sleep, and that sleepwalkers could perform complex activities while remaining unconscious. They observed that sleepwalking episodes often coincided with periods of high stress or emotional trauma, and they noted that sleepwalkers could be influenced by external stimuli without fully awakening. Dr. Constantinus Africanus, one of the most prominent medieval physicians, developed a comprehensive theory of aristocratic sleepwalking that was remarkably accurate by modern standards. He argued that the noble mind, trained from childhood in complex skills and behaviors, could continue performing these activities during sleep through what he called somnial memory, the ability of unconscious mental processes to access and execute learned behaviors without conscious control. But Constantinus also noted that aristocratic sleepwalking was often more sophisticated than peasant sleepwalking, suggesting that social class and education level affected the complexity of unconscious behaviors. Peasants who sleepwalked typically performed simple, repetitive tasks like farming or household chores, but nobles would engage in elaborate social, military, and intellectual activities that required advanced training and cultural knowledge. This class-based difference in sleepwalking behavior raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of consciousness and social hierarchy. If noble minds could perform complex aristocratic activities while unconscious, did that mean that aristocratic behavior was simply learned performance rather than inherent superiority? Were the nobles demonstrating that their elevated social position was based on training rather than natural nobility? The psychological toll on noble families was severe. Living with someone who regularly performed unpredictable activities while unconscious created constant anxiety and surveillance requirements. Spouses of noble sleepwalkers often developed their own sleep disorders from the stress of monitoring their partner's nocturnal activities. Children in these households grew up with the understanding that sleep was potentially dangerous and that unconscious minds could not be trusted. The servant class was particularly affected by aristocratic sleepwalking epidemics. Household staff were required to develop specialized skills for managing unconscious nobles, including techniques for safely redirecting sleepwalking activities, protocols for preventing injury during nocturnal episodes, and methods for documenting the details of unconscious behaviors for medical and legal purposes. Many servants quit rather than deal with the psychological stress of managing sleepwalking nobles. The constant vigilance required to prevent unconscious aristocrats from harming themselves or others was exhausting, and the unpredictable nature of sleepwalking episodes created working conditions that were both dangerous and psychologically traumatic. The most famous case of servant trauma involved the household of Duke Geoffrey of Brittany, whose sleepwalking episodes included violent combat reenactments with real weapons. 3 different servants were seriously injured attempting to disarm the Duke during his unconscious military exercises, and several others quit after witnessing what they described as demonic possession during particularly intense sleepwalking episodes. The seasonal patterns of aristocratic sleepwalking were another fascinating aspect of the phenomenon. Many noble sleepwalkers experienced more frequent and intense episodes during specific times of the year, often coinciding with anniversaries of traumatic events like major battles or political crises. This suggested that their unconscious minds were processing and re-experiencing significant psychological trauma through their sleepwalking behaviors. Sir Edmund de Grey's sleepwalking episodes always intensified during the winter months, specifically around the anniversary of a siege where he had lost most of his men to disease and starvation. His unconscious reenactments of the siege were so detailed and emotionally intense that his household dreaded the approach of winter, knowing that Edmund's sleeping mind would spend months reliving one of the most traumatic experiences of his military career. The contagious nature of aristocratic sleepwalking was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the phenomenon. In households where one family member was a chronic sleepwalker, other family members would often develop sleepwalking behaviors as well. This wasn't just coincidence. There seemed to be some kind of psychological transmission mechanism that allowed sleepwalking behaviors to spread through closely connected social groups. The household of Baron Robert de Vere experienced what amounted to a sleepwalking epidemic, with the Baron, his wife, 2 of his children, and several long-term servants all developing elaborate nocturnal behavioral patterns. The entire household would sometimes engage in coordinated sleepwalking activities, performing what appeared to be group ceremonies or shared reenactments of historical events while all participants remained unconscious. These group sleepwalking episodes were particularly disturbing because they suggested that unconscious minds could somehow communicate and coordinate with each other in ways that conscious awareness couldn't explain. The sleepwalkers would perform complementary roles in elaborate scenarios, responding to each other's actions and maintaining complex group dynamics while all participants remained asleep. The resolution strategies developed by medieval physicians were surprisingly effective. Rather than trying to prevent sleepwalking entirely, they focused on creating safe environments where unconscious activities could continue without causing harm. They developed techniques for redirecting sleepwalking behaviors toward less dangerous activities and methods for gradually reducing the intensity of episodes through environmental and dietary modifications. The Order of Cess. Benedict became particularly skilled at treating aristocratic sleepwalking, developing monastic therapies that combined religious counseling with practical sleep management techniques. Their approach recognized that sleepwalking was often related to unresolved psychological trauma, and that effective treatment required addressing both the unconscious symptoms and the conscious emotional issues that were driving them. But perhaps the most important insight from medieval aristocratic sleepwalking was the recognition that the sleeping mind was far more complex and capable than previously understood. These episodes demonstrated that unconscious mental processes could access sophisticated memories, perform complex skills, and even engage in creative problem-solving without any conscious involvement. The implications were profound for medieval understanding of human consciousness and social organization. If nobles could perform their aristocratic duties while unconscious, what did that say about the nature of leadership and social hierarchy? If unconscious minds could access knowledge and skills that weren't available to conscious awareness, what did that suggest about the relationship between sleep and learning? When your sleep becomes a military exercise, when your dreams require weapons and armor, when your unconscious mind can conduct business negotiations and diplomatic meetings more effectively than your conscious awareness, you're not just dealing with a sleep disorder, You're dealing with a complete breakdown of the boundaries between conscious and unconscious experience, between individual psychology and social performance, between sleep and waking reality. Medieval aristocratic sleepwalking reminds us that the sleeping mind is capable of far more sophisticated activities than we typically imagine, and that the line between conscious and unconscious behavior is much more fluid than most people realize. When your nightmares start requiring actual equipment and when your dreams begin affecting real-world politics and economics, you've entered a realm where sleep itself becomes a form of social activity with genuine consequences for everyone around you. There's a lesser-known case from 13th century England that's going to make you question everything you think you know about the boundaries between individual psychology and collective reality. We're talking about a single woman whose recurring nightmares somehow jumped from her sleeping mind into the dreams of everyone around her, and eventually into their waking reality until an entire village was living inside what had started as one person's private terror. This is the story of how personal trauma can become infectious, how nightmares can spread like a plague, and how a small English village was literally destroyed by shared dreams. Meet Margot the Weaver, though that probably wasn't her real name, since medieval chroniclers had a habit of changing names to protect the living or the dead, depending on their theological perspective on what was happening. Margot lived in a village called Little Wickham, somewhere in what's now Oxfordshire, a place so small and unremarkable that it doesn't even exist on modern maps. But in 1267, Little Wickham became the center of one of the most disturbing cases of psychological contagion ever recorded. Margot was, by all contemporary accounts, completely ordinary. A widow in her 30s, she made her living weaving cloth for the local manor house, kept a small garden, attended church regularly, and bothered absolutely no one. The kind of person who, in normal circumstances, would live her entire life without anyone bothering to write down her name. But Margot's dreams were anything but ordinary, and what started as her private nightmare would eventually consume her entire community. The dreams began sometime in the late summer of 1267, right after the harvest season. Margot started experiencing incredibly vivid, recurring nightmares about disasters that would befall Little Wickham. But these weren't vague anxiety dreams about bad things happening. They were detailed. Specific visions with precise locations, exact timing, and devastating consequences that she could describe down to the smallest detail. In her first recorded nightmare, Margot saw the village church burning while the congregation was trapped inside during Sunday Mass. She could describe exactly how the fire would start, a candle falling from the altar during the blessing of the bread, and exactly how it would spread through the wooden pews and up into the thatched roof. She could name specific villagers who would die in the fire, describe their final words, and even predict which parts of their bodies would be found in which sections of the church ruins. Now, you'd think people would just dismiss this as the ravings of a grieving widow with an overactive imagination, right? Wrong, because Margot didn't just describe these disasters, she experienced them. She would wake up screaming, her body covered in burns that weren't there, coughing up smoke that didn't exist, calling out the names of people who were dying in flames that only she could see. Her physical reactions to these dream disasters were so intense and realistic that her neighbors became convinced she was actually witnessing future events. But here's where the story gets really fucked up. Other people in the village started having the same dreams. Not similar dreams, not dreams inspired by Margot's descriptions, but identical dreams. The exact same church fire, with the same details, the same victims, the same sequence of events. Within a week of Margot's first nightmare, half a dozen other villagers were waking up screaming about the same burning church, experiencing the same phantom burns, calling out the same names. The psychological contagion spread with terrifying efficiency. It started with Margot's immediate neighbors, the people who had heard her initial nightmare descriptions and witnessed her physical reactions. But then it jumped to people who had no direct contact with Margot, people who lived on the other side of the village and had only heard second-hand accounts of her dreams. Within a month, nearly everyone in Little Wickham was experiencing some version of Margot's nightmares. But the shared dreaming wasn't just copying, it was evolving. Each person who started having Margot's nightmares would add their own details. their own perspective on the disasters she had originally envisioned. The church fire dream became more complex, more detailed, more terrifying as it passed through different minds. People were dreaming about conversations they would have while trapped in the burning church, about prayers they would say before dying, about the specific ways their families would mourn them. The dreams were so vivid and consistent that the village priest, Father Edmund, became convinced that God was sending prophetic visions to warn the community about future disasters. He organized special prayer services to prevent the church fire, had the building blessed multiple times, and even banned candles from the altar area during Mass. But instead of calming people's fears, these precautions only seemed to validate the reality of the nightmare visions, making everyone even more convinced that the disasters were genuinely prophetic. Margot's second major nightmare sequence involved a poisoned well. She dreamed that someone she could never see who would throw something into the village's main water source, causing everyone who drank from it to die in agony within hours. Again, the details were horrifically specific. The exact color the water would turn, the precise symptoms people would experience, the order in which different families would succumb to the poisoning. And again, the dream spread through the community like wildfire. Within days, dozens of villagers were having identical nightmares about poisoned water, experiencing phantom symptoms of poisoning while they slept, and waking up with an absolute terror of drinking from the communal well. The shared nightmare was so convincing that people stopped using the well entirely, forcing them to walk miles to other water sources or collect rainwater, creating genuine hardship based on collective dream experiences. But the poisoned well nightmares had an even more insidious effect. They made people suspicious of each other. If the well was going to be poisoned by someone in the community, then anyone could be the potential poisoner. Neighbors started watching each other with suspicion, looking for signs that someone might be planning to contaminate the water supply. The shared nightmare was transforming a close-knit village into a community of paranoid suspects. The third nightmare sequence was the most devastating. Margot dreamed about a plague of madness that would sweep through Little Wickham, causing people to attack their own families, destroy their homes, and ultimately abandon the village entirely. She saw specific villagers going insane in specific ways, the blacksmith beating his wife to death with his own hammer, the baker burning down his shop with his children inside, the manor lord killing his servants and then himself. This nightmare was different from the others because it seemed to be self-fulfilling. As more people shared the dream about madness and violence, they became increasingly paranoid about the possibility of their neighbors going insane. The fear of madness was making people act in ways that looked increasingly mad to their neighbors, creating a feedback loop where the nightmare was gradually becoming reality through the collective anxiety it generated. The village's social fabric began to unravel as the shared nightmares intensified. People stopped working together, stopped trusting each other, stopped participating in the communal activities that had held the community together for generations. Families began sleeping in shifts, with some members staying awake to watch for signs that their loved ones might be experiencing the prophetic nightmares that seemed to predict their own violent behavior. The most disturbing aspect of the Little Wickham nightmare epidemic was how accurate some of the predictions turned out to be. Not because Margot was actually psychic, but because people's behavior was being shaped by their shared dreams. When everyone in a community expects specific disasters to occur, when they're all mentally rehearsing the same catastrophic scenarios night after night, they start unconsciously creating the conditions that make those disasters more likely to happen. The church fire never happened exactly as Margot had dreamed it, but there were several smaller fires in the village that seemed to follow elements of the nightmare pattern. The well was never poisoned, but several people did become genuinely ill from contaminated water sources they turned to after abandoning the communal well. The plague of madness never swept through the village, but the paranoia and social breakdown caused by fear of the plague created many of the same effects. Medieval chroniclers who investigated the Little Wickham case were particularly interested in how the nightmare contagion affected different types of people. They noted that women were more likely than men to experience the full intensity of Margot's dreams, that children seemed especially susceptible to the psychological contagion. and that people who had experienced significant trauma in their own lives were more likely to become carriers of the shared nightmares. But they also observed that the nightmare contagion followed social networks rather than random patterns. The dreams spread most quickly through families, close friendships, and working relationships. People who had strong emotional connections to previous dreamers were more likely to start experiencing the same nightmares, suggesting that psychological intimacy created vulnerability to dream contagion. The role of storytelling in spreading the nightmares was particularly important. Each time someone described their nightmare experience to others, they weren't just sharing information, they were essentially planting the seeds of the same dream in other people's minds. The more vivid and detailed the description, the more likely the listener was to experience the same nightmare themselves. It was like a medieval version of viral content, except instead of spreading through social media, it was spreading through the medieval equivalent: gossip, storytelling, and communal gatherings. The village's attempts to stop the nightmare contagion were both understandable and completely counterproductive. They organized group prayers specifically focused on preventing the disasters from Margot's dreams, which had the effect of making everyone think about those disasters in even more detail. They held community meetings where people could share and discuss their nightmare experiences, which created more opportunities for the dreams to spread to new victims. Father Edmund tried to combat the nightmare epidemic through religious intervention, organizing exorcisms, blessing ceremonies, and special masses designed to protect the community from demonic influence. But his efforts backfired spectacularly when he started having the same nightmares himself. Once the village priest began experiencing Margot's prophetic dreams, the entire community became convinced that the nightmares were genuinely supernatural in origin. The breaking point came when Margot herself became terrified of her own dreams. She started claiming that the nightmares weren't just visions of future disasters, but that they were somehow causing the disasters they depicted. She became convinced that her dreaming mind was actively creating the catastrophes that were threatening her community, that she was somehow responsible for the psychological destruction of everyone around her. Margot's guilt and terror intensified her nightmare experiences, creating even more vivid and disturbing visions that spread through the community with increased intensity. She began having dreams about her own death, specifically dreams about throwing herself from the church tower to end the nightmare epidemic that she believed she was causing. And of course, other villagers started having the same dreams about Margot's suicide, creating a collective expectation that she would kill herself to save the community. The social pressure was enormous. People who had once been Margot's friends and neighbors began to see her as the source of their collective terror. Some openly suggested that she should leave the village to prevent the nightmares from spreading further. Others implied that her death might be the only way to break the psychological contagion that was destroying their community. The woman who had been an ordinary, harmless villager was transformed into a perceived threat to everyone around her. The psychological isolation was devastating for Margot. She was simultaneously the most important person in the village, the originator of the prophetic dreams that everyone believed were genuinely supernatural, and the most feared and ostracized. She couldn't have normal conversations with her neighbors because everyone was afraid that talking to her might intensify their own nightmare experiences. She couldn't participate in community activities because her presence seemed to trigger more intense shared dreaming episodes. The end of the Little Wickham nightmare epidemic was as sudden and dramatic as its beginning. On a cold morning in early 1268, about 6 months after the shared dreaming had begun, Margot was found dead at the base of the church tower. Whether she jumped, fell, or was pushed was never definitively determined, but her death matched exactly the suicide dreams that she and many other villagers had been experiencing for weeks. The immediate effect of Margot's death was to intensify the nightmare epidemic rather than end it. Now the shared dreams included detailed visions of Margot's final moments, her thoughts as she fell, and her ghostly appearances to different villagers after her death. The psychological contagion had evolved beyond the original disaster predictions to include ongoing supernatural encounters with Margot's spirit, creating a new layer of shared terror that was even more difficult to escape. But gradually, over the following months, the nightmare epidemic began to fade. Without Margot as the central figure generating new dream content, the shared visions became less vivid and less frequent. People slowly began to return to normal sleep patterns, though many continued to experience occasional nightmares related to their Little Wickham experiences for years afterward. The long-term consequences for the village were devastating. So many families had left during the height of the nightmare epidemic that Little Wickham never recovered its original population. The economic disruption caused by months of shared psychological terror had destroyed many of the local trades and businesses. The manor lord eventually abandoned the property, and within a generation, Little Wickham had ceased to exist as a functioning community. Medieval chroniclers who studied the Little Wickham case developed several theories about how nightmare contagion worked. Some believed that certain individuals were naturally susceptible to receiving prophetic dreams from supernatural sources, and that these dreams could spread through communities as a form of divine communication. Others argued that shared traumatic experiences could create psychological connections between people that allowed dreams and fears to spread like infectious diseases. The most sophisticated medieval analysis came from a Benedictine monk named Brother Thomas, who argued that nightmare contagion occurred when communities became so closely connected through shared fears and expectations that individual psychological experiences could become collective experiences. He observed that nightmare epidemics typically occurred in small, isolated communities where everyone knew everyone else intimately, creating conditions where individual trauma could become communal trauma. Brother Thomas also noted that nightmare contagion seemed to be related to unresolved collective guilt or anxiety. He argued that Margot's original nightmares had resonated with the community because they expressed fears and concerns that many villagers shared but had been unable to articulate. The nightmares became contagious because they gave form to psychological tensions that already existed within the community's social dynamics. The Little Wickham case also demonstrated how medieval communities dealt with individuals who were perceived as psychologically dangerous. Margot's transformation from ordinary villager to community threat illustrates how quickly social dynamics can change when people believe that one person's mental state is affecting everyone else's psychological well-being. The collective response to Margot, fear, ostracism, and ultimately the expectation of her death shows how medieval communities protected themselves from perceived psychological contagion. The most disturbing aspect of the Little Wickham nightmare epidemic is how it demonstrates the power of collective belief to create its own reality. The villagers' shared conviction that Margot's dreams were prophetic created a psychological environment where those prophecies became more likely to come true. Their collective fear of disaster made them more susceptible to the kinds of accidents and conflicts that the dreams had predicted. But perhaps most importantly, the case shows how individual psychological trauma can become collective trauma when communities are too small and too closely connected to maintain psychological boundaries between different people's experiences. Margot's personal nightmares became everyone's nightmares because the village lacked the social mechanisms to contain individual psychological disturbance. The legacy of Little Wickham extends far beyond medieval England. The case has been studied by modern psychologists as an example of how mass hysteria can develop and spread through small communities. The patterns observed in the nightmare epidemic, the role of a central figure, the importance of social networks in spreading psychological symptoms, the self-fulfilling nature of collective fears appear in many other historical episodes of mass psychological contagion. When one person's nightmares become everyone's reality, when individual trauma spreads through a community like an infectious disease, when shared fears become so powerful that they start creating the disasters, they predict you're not just dealing with bad dreams, you're dealing with the complete breakdown of psychological boundaries between individual and collective experience, with the terrifying possibility that consciousness itself might be more permeable and interconnected than we typically assume. The story of Margot the Weaver and Little Wickham reminds us that the line between individual psychology and social reality is much thinner than we like to believe. In the right circumstances, with the right combination of social closeness and psychological vulnerability, One person's private terror can become everyone's shared nightmare, and everyone's shared nightmare can become everyone's lived reality. In 1347, just before the Black Death hit Europe, there was a Benedictine monastery in northern France where every single monk began having identical nightmares that would make your worst horror movie look like a children's bedtime story. We're talking about the Abbey of St. Denis in Vexin, a place that had been peacefully devoted to prayer and contemplation for over 2 centuries, until it became the epicenter of what might be the most terrifying case of collective nightmare experience in medieval history. Picture this: 43 Benedictine monks, men who had dedicated their entire lives to spiritual discipline and mental tranquility, suddenly finding themselves trapped in the same recurring nightmare every single night. But this wasn't just any shared dream. They were all dreaming of a black horseman riding through their monastery, touching each monk on the forehead with a skeletal finger, marking them for death in the exact order they would die in real life. The Abbey of St. Denis en Vexin wasn't some backwater religious outpost. This was a wealthy, influential monastery with connections to the royal court, extensive landholdings, and one of the most impressive libraries in northern France. These weren't superstitious peasants prone to flights of fancy. These were educated men, many from noble families who had spent years studying theology, philosophy, and natural science. When they all started having the same terrifying dream simultaneously, even the most rational explanations seemed inadequate. Brother Joachim, the monastery's chronicler, kept detailed records of the nightmare epidemic that are so disturbing they read like something Stephen King would reject as too unrealistic. According to his accounts, the shared nightmare always followed the same pattern. The monks would find themselves in the monastery's main chapel during what appeared to be midnight prayers, but the familiar space would be transformed into something subtly wrong. The chapel looked normal at first glance, but closer inspection revealed horrific details. The crucifixes were hanging upside down, the holy water had turned black, and the stained glass windows depicted scenes of torture and damnation instead of biblical stories. The air would be thick with the smell of sulfur and rotting flesh, and strange whispers in unknown languages would echo from the stone walls. But the truly terrifying part was when the black horseman would appear. He wasn't riding a normal horse. This creature was skeletal, with glowing red eyes and hooves that sparked against the stone floor as it moved. The rider himself was even more disturbing, a figure in black robes whose face was completely hidden, except for 2 burning eyes that seemed to see directly into each monk's soul. The horseman would ride slowly through the chapel, approaching each monk individually. When he reached out to touch someone's forehead, that monk would experience a vision of his own death. Not just how he would die, but when, where, and in what specific circumstances. The visions were incredibly detailed, showing not just the moment of death, but the days leading up to it, the final thoughts the monk would have, and even what would happen to his body afterward. What made these death visions so terrifying was their clinical precision. Brother Joachim recorded descriptions that included exact times of death, specific symptoms of illness, and detailed predictions about what each monk would be doing in his final moments. These weren't vague prophecies, they were like watching medical documentaries of deaths that hadn't happened yet. Brother Francois was the first to receive the Black Horseman's touch in the shared nightmare, and his death vision was particularly horrific. He saw himself in the monastery's infirmary, dying of what appeared to be plague symptoms, but this was months before the Black Death reached France. In his vision, he watched his own body covered in bubonic swellings, saw himself coughing up blood, and experienced his final moments of consciousness as the disease shut down his organs. The level of medical detail in his death vision was so accurate that it seemed impossible he could have imagined it. Brother Martin's death vision was different but equally disturbing. He saw himself dying of what appeared to be poisoning, with specific symptoms that wouldn't be identified by medical science for centuries. His vision included details about how different toxins would affect his nervous system, his digestive tract, and his cardiovascular system, presented with a level of biochemical accuracy that no medieval monk should have possessed. The most unsettling aspect of these death visions was that they began coming true. Brother Francois developed the exact plague symptoms from his nightmare and died on the precise date and at the exact time his vision had predicted. Brother Martin showed signs of systematic poisoning that matched his death vision perfectly, dying exactly when and how the Black Horseman had foretold. The abbot initially dismissed the shared nightmares as pre-plague anxiety. The Black Death had been ravaging other parts of Europe, and news of the devastating pandemic had been reaching the monastery through travelers and correspondence with other religious houses. It seemed reasonable that the monks' collective anxiety about the approaching plague might manifest as shared nightmares about death and pestilence. But when the nightmare predictions started coming true with supernatural accuracy, the abbot's rational explanation crumbled. These weren't just anxiety dreams, they were detailed prophecies that were being fulfilled with terrifying precision. The monastery was forced to confront the possibility that they were experiencing genuine supernatural communication, that the Black Horseman was actually some kind of divine or demonic messenger predicting their future deaths. The psychological impact on the surviving monks was catastrophic. Imagine knowing exactly when and how you're going to die, having seen your own death played out in vivid detail while you sleep. Imagine watching your fellow monks die exactly as the shared nightmare had predicted, knowing that your turn is coming and that there's apparently nothing you can do to prevent it. Brother Augustine developed what would now be recognized as severe anxiety disorder and depression after his encounter with the Black Horseman. His death vision had shown him dying of starvation, slowly wasting away as he refused to eat anything out of fear that all food was contaminated. In real life, Augustine began displaying the exact symptoms from his nightmare. He stopped eating, became obsessed with food contamination, and started the slow process of starving himself to death exactly as his vision had predicted. The monastery's daily routine completely collapsed as the nightmare epidemic intensified. Monks became afraid to sleep because they might encounter the Black Horseman and receive their own death vision. They started sleeping in shifts, with some staying awake to pray over their sleeping brothers and wake them if they showed signs of nightmare distress. But the Black Horseman adapted to their defenses. He began appearing to the watchers while they were awake, blurring the line between dream and reality. Brother Benedict, one of the designated nightmare watchers, reported seeing the Black Horseman appear in the monastery's chapel during his midnight prayer vigil. But this wasn't a dream. Benedict was fully awake, engaged in conscious prayer, when the supernatural figure materialized in front of him. The horseman didn't just touch Benedict's forehead. He spoke to him, describing in detail how the entire monastery would be abandoned before the plague even arrived, how the surviving monks would flee in terror, leaving behind all their possessions and their life's work. The waking appearances of the Black Horseman were even more disturbing than the shared nightmares because they eliminated the possibility that this was purely psychological phenomenon. When multiple monks reported seeing the same supernatural figure while awake, during different time periods and in different locations within the monastery, it became impossible to dismiss the experience as mass hysteria or shared delusion. The monastery's library contained extensive records of supernatural encounters, demonic visitations, and prophetic dreams, giving the monks a theological framework for understanding what was happening to them. According to medieval Christian doctrine, shared supernatural experiences like this could be either divine warnings sent by God or demonic attacks designed to destroy faith and cause despair. Brother Joachim consulted every theological text in their library, searching for precedents for their situation. He found references to similar cases in other monasteries, shared nightmares that predicted deaths, supernatural figures that appeared to entire religious communities, and cases where divine or demonic messages were delivered through collective dream experiences. But none of the historical cases matched the precision and accuracy of their Black Horseman encounters. The theological implications were staggering. If the Black Horseman was a divine messenger, then God was essentially telling them that they were all doomed to die in specific, horrible ways, and that their deaths were predetermined and unavoidable. If the horseman was demonic, then Satan had somehow gained access to their monastery and was using supernatural knowledge to terrorize them with accurate predictions of their future deaths. Either interpretation was theologically problematic. A god who would torture his faithful servants with detailed previews of their deaths seemed cruel and arbitrary. A Satan who could accurately predict future events suggested that demonic forces had access to divine knowledge, which challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of good and evil, divine omniscience, and human free will. The monastery sought help from other religious authorities, sending detailed letters to bishops, theologians, and other abbots describing their supernatural experiences and requesting guidance. The responses were uniformly unhelpful. Most religious authorities either dismissed the accounts as mass hysteria or suggested that the monastery had somehow brought the supernatural attacks on themselves through spiritual failings. Bishop Guillaume of Paris sent a team of investigators to examine the monastery and determine whether the supernatural experiences were genuine or imaginary. The investigators spent 2 weeks at St. Denis in Vexin, interviewing monks, observing their daily routines, and participating in their prayer services. 3 of the investigators reported having their own encounters with the Black Horsemen, experiencing death visions that they found so disturbing they immediately left the monastery and refused to discuss the details of their experiences. The investigation report, preserved in the archives of the Diocese of Paris, concluded that the Abbey of St. Denis in Vexin was experiencing supernatural visitations of unknown origin and malevolent intent. The investigators recommended that the monastery be abandoned and that the surviving monks be relocated to other religious houses, arguing that whatever was causing the shared nightmares and supernatural appearances was too dangerous to be confronted directly. But abandoning the monastery wasn't a simple decision. St. Denis in Vexin represented centuries of religious dedication, accumulated wealth, and scholarly achievement. The library alone contained irreplaceable manuscripts, theological treatises, and historical records that would be lost if the monastery were abandoned. The monks were being asked to sacrifice their entire life's work based on supernatural experiences that they couldn't fully understand or explain. The breaking point came when Brother Joachim, the chronicler who had been documenting the nightmare epidemic, received his own death vision from the Black Horsemen. Unlike the other monks, whose death visions showed them dying from plague or poison or starvation, Joachim's vision showed him dying from pure terror, literally being frightened to death by supernatural knowledge that his human mind couldn't process. In his vision, Joachim saw himself in the monastery's library, surrounded by books that contained knowledge about the true nature of reality, knowledge so horrible and incomprehensible that exposure to it would cause his mind to completely break down. He watched himself read passages that revealed the ultimate fate of human souls, the true purpose of suffering and death, and the cosmic insignificance of human existence. The knowledge was so devastating that his heart simply stopped beating from the psychological shock. Brother Joachim's death vision was different from the others because it suggested that the Black Horseman wasn't just predicting deaths, he was revealing fundamental truths about existence that were too terrible for human consciousness to endure. The other monks had been shown how they would die, but Joachim was shown why death was preferable to certain types of knowledge. The psychological impact of Joachim's death vision on the other monks was immediate and catastrophic. If their chronicler, the man responsible for maintaining the monastery's intellectual life, was going to die from exposure to forbidden knowledge, then their entire scholarly enterprise was potentially deadly. The library that had been the pride of their monastery became a source of supernatural terror. Monks began avoiding the library, afraid that they might accidentally encounter whatever deadly knowledge Joachim's vision had revealed. Some started destroying books and manuscripts, convinced that certain texts contained information that was too dangerous for human minds to process. The intellectual life of the monastery, which had been thriving for centuries, collapsed within weeks as fear of supernatural knowledge replaced their scholarly curiosity. The end of the Abbey of St. Denis in Vexin was as sudden and dramatic as the beginning of their nightmare epidemic. On a cold morning in November 1347, exactly 6 months after the shared nightmares had begun, the surviving monks simply left. They abandoned the monastery in the middle of the night, taking nothing with them except the clothes they were wearing and whatever portable religious artifacts they could carry. Brother Joachim's final chronicle entry, written on the night before the abandonment, provides a chilling glimpse into the psychological state of the surviving monks. We cannot remain here. The Black Horseman has shown us truths that no mortal mind should know. Death would be preferable to the knowledge he offers. We flee not from death, but from understanding. The monastery was found empty by plague investigators who arrived weeks later, expecting to find evidence of Black Death casualties. Instead, they discovered a perfectly preserved religious community that had been abandoned so suddenly that meals were still on tables. Books were open as if readers had simply vanished mid-sentence, and beds were unmade as if people had gotten up in the middle of the night and never returned. The investigators' report described finding the monastery's wine cellar, which contained dozens of barrels of wine that had been contaminated with ergot fungus. The ergot contamination was so severe that even small amounts of the wine would have caused powerful hallucinations, delirium, and psychological disturbances. The monks had been essentially microdosing LSD-like compounds every time they drank their communion wine, creating shared psychedelic experiences that they interpreted as supernatural visitations. The discovery of the ergot contamination provided a rational explanation for the monastery's supernatural experiences, but it didn't diminish the psychological impact of what the monks had endured. Whether the Black Horseman was a supernatural entity or a shared hallucination caused by psychoactive compounds, the experience had been real enough to destroy a thriving religious community and scatter its members across Europe. The irony wasn't lost on medieval observers. A monastery devoted to spiritual transcendence and divine communication had been destroyed by chemicals that actually did provide access to altered states of consciousness. The monks had been seeking supernatural experiences through prayer and contemplation, but they had found them through accidental drug consumption that they couldn't recognize or control. The scattered monks of St. Denis and Vexin never reunited as a community. Those who survived were absorbed into other monasteries across Europe, but many carried psychological trauma from their shared nightmare experiences for the rest of their lives. Several developed chronic insomnia, afraid to sleep because they might encounter the Black Horseman again. Others became obsessed with death and dying, unable to function normally because they had seen too clearly how their lives would end. Brother Augustine, whose nightmare death vision had involved starvation, actually did die of self-imposed starvation 3 years after leaving the monastery. Brother Martin died of what appeared to be poisoning, though the circumstances were never clearly established. Brother Francois died of plague symptoms during the Black Death's second wave, fulfilling his nightmare prophecy years after he had first experienced it. But the most disturbing aspect of the St. Denis and Vexin case was how it demonstrated the power of shared psychological experiences to create their own reality. The monks' collective belief in the accuracy of their death visions may have made those visions more likely to come true, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy effect where their nightmare experiences shaped their subsequent behavior and life outcomes. The case also illustrates how medieval communities interpreted psychoactive drug experiences when they occurred accidentally and without scientific understanding. The monks' ergot-induced hallucinations were indistinguishable from genuine supernatural encounters within their theological worldview, creating a situation where chemical effects were interpreted as divine or demonic, communication with unpredictable and often devastating consequences. Modern researchers who have studied the St. Denis and Vexin case note that ergot contamination in wine would have created particularly intense and coherent hallucinogenic experiences because alcohol enhances the absorption and effectiveness of ergot alkaloids. The monks were unknowingly consuming a psychedelic cocktail that was perfectly designed to produce shared, detailed visions that would seem supernaturally real and significant. The monastery's library, abandoned so suddenly in 1347, was eventually pillaged by looters and local peasants who had no idea what they were destroying. Priceless manuscripts were used as kindling, theological treatises were torn apart for their parchment, and centuries of scholarly work vanished within months of the monks' departure. The intellectual loss was as devastating as the human tragedy, representing the destruction of knowledge and cultural achievement that could never be recovered. The site of the Abbey of St. Denis and Vexin remained abandoned for decades after the monks' departure. Local peasants claimed to see strange lights in the ruins at night and reported hearing the sound of galloping horses on the old monastery grounds. Whether these were genuine supernatural phenomena, psychological aftereffects of the monastery's tragic history, or simply local folklore inspired by the dramatic story of the abandoned religious community, the site acquired a reputation for being haunted that persisted for generations. When an entire religious community can be destroyed by contaminated wine and shared nightmares, when the line between divine communication and drug-induced hallucination becomes impossible to distinguish, when people's deepest spiritual beliefs can be shattered by accidental chemical experiences, you're not just dealing with medieval superstition. You're dealing with fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, reality, and religious experience that remain unresolved even today. The story of the Abbey of St. Denis in Vexin reminds us that the medieval world was a place where spiritual experiences and chemical... Winter of 1284. There was a 7-year-old girl in a small English village called Little Thornwick who developed the strangest, most unsettling sleep disorder imaginable. And when I say strange, I mean this is the kind of story that'll make you grateful for your privacy. Because this little girl, let's call her Mary, though her real name has been lost to the medieval habit of not bothering to record women's names unless they were saints or queens, had somehow developed the supernatural ability to dream about what every single person in her village was doing at that exact moment. Not prophetic dreams about the future, not memories of past events, but real-time surveillance dreams of current activities happening simultaneously while she slept. Little Thornwick was the kind of village where everyone knew everyone else's business anyway, or thought they did. We're talking about maybe 200 people living in close quarters, where your neighbor's kitchen window looked directly into your bedroom, where gossip traveled faster than the plague, and where keeping secrets was about as difficult as keeping water in a basket. But Mary's dreams revealed that even in a community where privacy was practically non-existent, people still managed to have secrets, private moments, and hidden activities that they thought were completely unobserved. The first sign that something unusual was happening came when Mary started mentioning things at breakfast that she couldn't possibly have known. She would casually mention that old Thomas the Miller had been counting his hidden coins again last night, or that the blacksmith's wife had been crying in her garden while everyone else was asleep, or that Father Benedict had been practicing his sermons in front of his mirror at midnight. These weren't wild guesses or lucky observations. They were precise, detailed accounts of activities that had actually occurred during the exact hours when Mary was supposedly asleep in her own bed. Her parents, simple farming folk who had never encountered anything like this, initially dismissed these comments as the kind of imaginative storytelling that children often engage in. But when Mary started providing details that were too specific and too accurate to be coincidental, they began to pay more serious attention to her nocturnal revelations. She could describe exactly what people were wearing during their private moments, what they were eating, what they were saying, even what expressions were on their faces when they thought no one was watching. The breakthrough, or breakdown, depending on your perspective, came when Mary described watching the village. Reeve conduct his midnight inventory of the manor's grain stores. This was significant because the Reeve was suspected of stealing grain, but no one had been able to prove it because he always did his pilfering alone in the middle of the night when everyone else was asleep. But Mary described, in perfect detail, exactly how he moved the grain sacks to hide the theft, which specific storage areas he targeted, and even the methods he used to disguise the missing quantities. When the manor lord conducted an investigation based on Mary's dream descriptions, he found evidence of grain theft that matched her account exactly. The hiding places she had described were real, the accounting tricks she had witnessed were accurate, and the stolen grain was recovered from the precise locations she had identified. The Reeve confessed immediately when confronted with evidence that could only have come from direct observation, but no one had been observing him except a 7-year-old girl who was supposedly asleep in her bed miles away. Word of Mary's supernatural surveillance abilities spread through Little Thornwick like wildfire, creating a level of paranoia and social anxiety that was unprecedented in the village's history. If a sleeping child could observe everyone's private activities simultaneously, then no one's secrets were safe, no one's private moments were actually private, and no one could be certain that their most intimate or embarrassing behaviors weren't being watched and potentially reported. The psychological impact on the community was immediate and devastating. People became afraid to do anything private or personal, knowing that Mary might be watching them in her dreams and could potentially reveal their activities to the entire village. Marriages began to suffer as spouses became paranoid about their private conversations being overheard. Business relationships deteriorated as merchants and craftsmen worried that their professional secrets might be exposed through Mary's dream surveillance. But the most disturbing aspect of Mary's ability was the level of detail she could provide about people's private thoughts and emotions. She didn't just see what people were doing, she somehow had access to their internal experiences, their feelings, their motivations, and their unspoken concerns. She would describe not just that someone was crying, but why they were crying, what specific memories or worries were causing their distress, and what they were thinking about while experiencing their emotions. Margaret, the baker's wife, was the first person to have her deepest secrets exposed through Mary's dream surveillance. Mary casually mentioned at Sunday service that Margaret had been awake all night thinking about the baby she had lost 3 years earlier, a pregnancy that Margaret had never told anyone about, including her husband. Mary described Margaret's exact thoughts, her specific memories of the miscarriage, and even the private prayer she had been saying for her lost child. Margaret's reaction was a combination of horror, embarrassment, and genuine fear. The loss of her pregnancy had been her most private grief, something she had never shared with anyone in the village. The fact that a 7-year-old child could access these intimate memories through her dreams suggested that no aspect of personal experience was safe from supernatural surveillance. Margaret became convinced that Mary was either possessed by demons or had been given supernatural powers by dark forces. The village priest, Father Benedict, was equally disturbed by Mary's abilities, but for different reasons. His own private activities were being observed and potentially reported by a child who should have been completely unaware of his personal struggles with faith, his doubts about his religious calling, and his private attempts to cope with the isolation and celibacy required by his position. Mary had described his midnight prayers, his private confessions, and even his moments of religious doubt with perfect accuracy. Father Benedict's theological interpretation of Mary's abilities was complex and troubling. On one hand, supernatural knowledge of hidden activities could be a gift from God, a form of divine revelation that allowed truth to be revealed and justice to be served. On the other hand, the invasive nature of Mary's surveillance, the way it violated people's privacy and exposed their most intimate secrets, seemed more consistent with demonic attack than divine blessing. The social dynamics of Little Thornwick began to change in fundamental ways as people adapted to living under constant supernatural surveillance. Some villagers tried to use Mary's abilities to their advantage, asking her to spy on their neighbors, business rivals, or romantic interests. Others attempted to curry favor with Mary's family, hoping that friendly relationships might protect them from having their secrets exposed. But most people simply became increasingly isolated and paranoid, afraid to engage in any private behavior that they wouldn't want the entire village to know about. Normal human activities like private conversations with family members, personal hygiene routines, intimate moments between spouses, and private religious observances all became sources of anxiety and self-consciousness. The economic impact of Mary's supernatural surveillance was significant. Business negotiations became almost impossible when one party knew that their private strategies and bottom-line positions might be revealed through dream surveillance. Trade relationships suffered as merchants became unwilling to visit a village, where their private activities could be observed and reported by a sleeping child. Thomas the merchant, who had been conducting regular business in Little Thornwick for over a decade, stopped visiting entirely after Mary accurately described his private inventory assessments, pricing strategies, and profit calculations. He became convinced that continuing to do business in a village with supernatural surveillance capabilities would inevitably lead to economic disadvantage and loss of competitive advantage. The legal implications of Mary's abilities were equally problematic. How do you maintain normal standards of evidence and testimony when a child can provide detailed accounts of crimes and misconduct that occurred when no other witnesses were present? How do you protect people's rights to privacy when that privacy can be violated through supernatural means that no one understands or controls? The village court struggled with several cases where Mary's dream observations provided evidence of wrongdoing that couldn't be obtained through normal legal processes. Her surveillance had revealed theft, adultery, property damage, and various forms of misconduct that would have remained hidden without supernatural intervention. But using evidence obtained through supernatural surveillance raised questions about the fairness and legitimacy of legal proceedings. Sir Geoffrey, the manor lord, was particularly concerned about the precedent that might be set by using Mary's abilities for law enforcement purposes. If supernatural surveillance could be used to obtain evidence of wrongdoing, what protections did people have against false accusations, misinterpretation of observed activities, or selective enforcement based on supernatural information that couldn't be independently verified? The most disturbing legal case involved accusations of witchcraft against Eleanor the herb woman, based entirely on Mary's dream observations of Eleanor's private activities. Mary had described watching Eleanor perform what appeared to be magical rituals, including herb preparation ceremonies that involved unusual chanting, symbolic arrangements of natural materials, and behaviors that could be interpreted as supernatural in nature. Eleanor's defense was that her activities were simply traditional herbal medicine practices that had been passed down through her family for generations. But Mary's detailed descriptions of Eleanor's private rituals, including specific words and gestures that Eleanor had never performed in public, created a compelling case for supernatural activity that was difficult to refute through conventional means. The witchcraft trial that resulted from Mary's supernatural surveillance became a source of division within Little Thornwick. Some villagers believed that Mary's abilities were genuinely divine and that her observations should be trusted as evidence of Eleanor's magical practices. Others argued that using supernatural surveillance as evidence in legal proceedings was inherently unfair and that Eleanor was being persecuted based on private activities that should have remained private regardless of their nature. The trial was eventually resolved when Eleanor agreed to leave the village voluntarily rather than face potential execution for witchcraft. But her departure represented a significant loss for the community. Eleanor had been the village's primary source of medical knowledge and herbal remedies, and her exile left many people without access to health care that they had relied upon for decades. Mary's own psychological development was severely affected by her supernatural abilities. A 7-year-old child shouldn't have access to the private thoughts, secret behaviors, and intimate activities of adults in her community. The knowledge she gained through her dream surveillance exposed her to information about sexuality, violence, financial misconduct, and emotional trauma that was completely inappropriate for her age and psychological development. Her parents struggled with how to manage Mary's supernatural abilities while protecting her from the psychological damage that could result from exposure to adult secrets and private behaviors. They tried limiting her social interactions, hoping to reduce the amount of information she gathered through her dream surveillance. But Mary's abilities seemed to operate independently of her conscious awareness, continuing to provide her with detailed information about everyone in the village, regardless of her parents' attempts to control her exposure. The isolation that resulted from her parents' protective efforts only intensified Mary's psychological distress. She became increasingly withdrawn and anxious, burdened by knowledge of adult problems that she couldn't understand or process appropriately. She knew about marital problems, financial difficulties, health issues, and personal traumas affecting everyone in her community, but she lacked the emotional maturity to cope with this information effectively. Mary also began to experience guilt and anxiety about her role in exposing people's secrets. She understood that her dream revelations were causing distress and social problems for her neighbors, but she had no control over what she observed or how the information was used by others. She became convinced that her supernatural abilities were harmful to her community, and that she was somehow responsible for the paranoia and social breakdown that had followed her revelations. The religious community's response to Mary's abilities was divided and conflicted. Some members of the clergy viewed her supernatural surveillance as a form of divine revelation that could be used to expose sin and promote moral behavior. Others saw her abilities as demonic in origin, arguing that the invasive nature of her surveillance and the social discord it created were more consistent with evil influences than divine blessing. Brother Marcus, a visiting Franciscan monk who spent several weeks studying Mary's case, developed a complex theological analysis of her abilities. He argued that supernatural surveillance of private activities violated the divine principle of free will, since people couldn't exercise moral choice if they believed their private decisions were being constantly monitored and potentially exposed. Brother Marcus also noted that Mary's abilities seemed to be particularly focused on revealing information that would cause maximum social disruption and personal distress, rather than exposing information that would promote justice or moral improvement. Her surveillance often revealed private activities that were embarrassing or socially damaging, but not necessarily sinful or illegal. This pattern suggested to Brother Marcus that Mary's abilities might be designed to destroy social cohesion and trust rather than promote divine justice. He recommended that the Church intervene to either control or eliminate Mary's supernatural surveillance capabilities, arguing that they represented a form of spiritual attack on the community rather than divine blessing. The seasonal patterns of Mary's supernatural surveillance were another troubling aspect of her abilities. Her dream observations seemed to intensify during periods of high social stress or community tension. During harvest season, when economic pressures were highest, she would provide more detailed information about financial misconduct and resource theft. During winter months, when people were confined to their homes and more likely to engage in private activities, her surveillance would focus on intimate family dynamics and personal relationships. This correlation between social stress and surveillance intensity suggested that Mary's abilities might be responding to community anxiety levels, creating a feedback loop where social tension intensified supernatural surveillance, which in turn created more social tension and paranoia. The community was trapped in a cycle of increasing surveillance and decreasing privacy that seemed to feed on itself. The attempted interventions by Mary's family and community were both desperate and ineffective. Her parents tried moving her bed to different locations, hoping that physical distance might limit her surveillance abilities. They attempted various folk remedies and protective rituals designed to block supernatural influences. They even consulted with traveling wise women and healers who claimed to understand supernatural abilities in children. Nothing worked. Mary's dream surveillance continued regardless of physical barriers, protective rituals, or attempts to limit her supernatural exposure. Her abilities seemed to be an inherent part of her consciousness rather than an external influence that could be blocked or redirected through conventional means. The village's collective attempts to cope with Mary's surveillance were equally unsuccessful. Some families tried conducting their private activities at different times, hoping to avoid being observed during Mary's sleeping hours. Others attempted to leave the village temporarily when they needed privacy for important personal or business matters. But Mary's surveillance abilities seemed to adapt to these evasion attempts. When people changed their routines to avoid her normal sleeping hours, she would have dreams during different sleep periods that captured their relocated private activities. When families left the village for privacy, she would dream about their activities in other locations, demonstrating that her surveillance capabilities weren't limited by geographic proximity. The breaking point came when Mary's surveillance abilities began affecting her own family's privacy. She started having dreams about her parents' private conversations, personal concerns, and intimate moments. Her mother and father found themselves unable to have normal private discussions about family matters, knowing that their daughter might be observing and potentially reporting their private communications. The psychological pressure of living under surveillance from their own child became unbearable for Mary's parents. They couldn't discipline her, plan family activities, or discuss personal matters without worrying about supernatural observation. Their marriage began to suffer as the stress of constant surveillance eliminated their ability to have private conversations or intimate moments. The final crisis occurred when Mary began having dreams about planned activities rather than just current activities. She started reporting on people's private plans, secret intentions, and future activities that were still in the planning stages. This evolution of her abilities from surveillance of current activities to surveillance of future plans created a new level of social anxiety and paranoia. When people realized that even their private thoughts and preliminary plans were being observed through supernatural surveillance, normal social planning became impossible. Business strategies, personal relationships, family decisions, and even private hopes and dreams all became potentially public information that could be revealed through Mary's enhanced surveillance abilities. The resolution of Mary's case was as sudden and mysterious as the development of her abilities. On a cold morning in March 1285, about a year after her supernatural surveillance had begun, Mary's family discovered that she had vanished from her bed during the night. Despite extensive searches by the entire village, no trace of her was ever found. Some villagers believed that Mary had been taken by supernatural forces, either divine or demonic, that were responsible for her surveillance abilities. Others suspected that her family had secretly relocated her to protect her from the social tensions her abilities had created. A few cynical observers suggested that Mary had been murdered by someone whose secrets she had threatened to expose. But the most disturbing theory was that Mary had somehow transcended normal physical existence, becoming a purely supernatural entity whose consciousness could observe human activities without being constrained by physical location or bodily limitations. According to this interpretation, her disappearance represented an evolution from supernatural surveillance to complete spiritual detachment from physical reality. The immediate effect of Mary's disappearance was relief throughout Little Thornwick. People could finally return to normal private activities without fear of supernatural surveillance. Business relationships resumed, social interactions became less paranoid, and family life gradually returned to normal patterns of privacy and intimacy. But the long-term psychological impact of living under supernatural surveillance for an entire year had permanently changed the community. Many villagers continued to feel anxious about their private activities, as if they were still being watched even though Mary was gone. Trust relationships that had been damaged by surveillance revelations never fully recovered. The social fabric of Little Thornwick had been permanently altered by the experience of losing privacy to supernatural observation. The disappearance also left unresolved questions about the nature and origin of Mary's abilities. Without understanding how her supernatural surveillance had developed or what had caused it to end, the community remained anxious about the possibility that similar abilities might emerge in other children, or that Mary herself might return with enhanced surveillance capabilities. Modern psychological analysis of Mary's case suggests several possible explanations for her apparent supernatural abilities. Some researchers argue that she may have been an unusually observant child who gathered information through normal sensory means but presented it as dream surveillance to avoid accusations of spying. Others suggest that her case represents an early example of what would now be recognized as dissociative identity disorder, other psychological conditions that can create apparent supernatural abilities. But the historical records of Mary's case include verification of information that she couldn't have obtained through normal observation or social interaction. Her accurate descriptions of private activities occurring simultaneously in different locations, her knowledge of secret plans and hidden objects, and her access to information about people's private thoughts and emotions all suggest capabilities that extend beyond normal childhood observation skills. The most disturbing aspect of Mary's case is how it demonstrates the social chaos that can result from loss of privacy, even when that loss is caused by supernatural rather than technological means. The paranoia, social breakdown, and destruction of trust relationships that occurred in Little Thornwick mirror many of the concerns raised by modern surveillance technology and loss of privacy in digital societies. When a single child's supernatural abilities can destroy an entire community's social fabric, when privacy becomes impossible due to forces beyond human control, when people's most intimate secrets become public information through means they can't understand or prevent, you're not just dealing with supernatural phenomena. You're dealing with fundamental questions about privacy, social trust, and the psychological requirements for normal human community that remain relevant in any era where surveillance capabilities exceed people's ability to maintain personal boundaries. The story of Mary and Little Thornwick reminds us that privacy isn't just a luxury or convenience. It's a fundamental requirement for normal psychological development, healthy social relationships, and functional community life. When privacy is eliminated, whether through supernatural surveillance or technological monitoring, the result is inevitably social paranoia, relationship breakdown, and community dysfunction that can persist long after the surveillance itself has ended. Let's slow down a bit and talk about why these nightmare epidemics happened in medieval times, and why they were so much more intense, so much more devastating, and so much more collectively experienced than anything we see today. Because once you understand the medieval framework for interpreting dreams, sleep, and consciousness itself, these stories stop seeming like random supernatural weirdness and start looking like inevitable consequences of a completely different way of understanding reality. The medieval understanding of dreams was fundamentally, radically different from ours in ways that most people today can't even begin to comprehend. We think of dreams as random neural activity during sleep, but basically your brain's screensaver, processing the day's information and filing it away while your consciousness takes a break. Medieval people saw dreams as communications from other realms of existence, as direct channels between the human mind and supernatural forces that were constantly trying to influence human behavior and spiritual development. Think about that difference for a moment. When you have a bad dream tonight, you might be annoyed or disturbed for a few minutes after you wake up, but you fundamentally understand that it was just your brain doing brain things while you were unconscious. But imagine if you genuinely believed that every single dream was a message from God, a temptation from demons, a warning from dead relatives, or a glimpse into future events that you were morally obligated to take seriously. Medieval physicians and theologians had developed an incredibly sophisticated classification system for dreams that would make modern psychology look simplistic by comparison. They didn't just say dreams are random, they had detailed taxonomies that categorized different types of supernatural communication and provided specific guidelines for interpreting and responding to each category. Oraculum dreams were direct messages from God or saints, usually involving explicit instructions about moral behavior or warnings about spiritual dangers. These were considered the most reliable and important type of dream, requiring immediate action and careful compliance with whatever divine guidance was being provided. If you had an oraculum dream telling you to change your behavior, abandon your current life, or prepare for specific future events, you were expected to treat that guidance as seriously as direct orders from earthly authorities. Visio dreams were prophetic visions of future events, but unlike oraculum dreams, they weren't necessarily accompanied by specific divine instructions. These dreams showed you what was coming, but left you to figure out how to respond appropriately. The challenge with visio dreams was determining whether the predicted future was fixed and inevitable or whether the prophecy was intended to help you change course and avoid negative outcomes. Vision dreams were demonic deceptions designed to corrupt the soul through false information, tempting visions, or psychological manipulation. These were considered extremely dangerous because they could appear to be divine communications while actually leading people towards sin, despair, or spiritual destruction. The medieval understanding was that demons were highly intelligent supernatural entities who could create convincing false dreams to undermine human spiritual development. Somnium dreams were symbolic visions that required interpretation to understand their meaning. These weren't direct communications, but rather coded messages that revealed important information about spiritual states, future events, or divine will through metaphorical imagery that needed to be decoded by people with appropriate theological training and spiritual insight. This classification system meant that medieval people took their dreams incredibly seriously. Every morning when you woke up, you had to analyze your dream experiences to determine which category they belonged to, what supernatural forces might be trying to communicate with you, and what actions you needed to take in response to the information you had received during sleep. But here's where it gets really interesting and really terrifying from a modern psychological perspective. Medieval people didn't see dream interpretation as a private, individual activity. Dreams were considered community information that needed to be shared, discussed, and collectively analyzed to determine their meaning and significance. If you had a significant dream, you were expected to tell other people about it so that the community could help you understand its implications and respond appropriately. Imagine living in a world where your private dream experiences were automatically treated as public information that required community discussion and collective decision-making. Every nightmare, every strange vision, every disturbing sleep experience became a social event that potentially affected not just you but everyone around you. This social framework created perfect conditions for psychological contagion, where one person's disturbing dream could trigger similar experiences in other community members. The medieval understanding of how dreams worked was based on a sophisticated theory of consciousness that recognized the interconnectedness of human minds in ways that modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover. They believed that during sleep, the rational mind that normally controlled thought and behavior would shut down, leaving the imaginative mind vulnerable to influence from external supernatural forces and internal psychological pressures. But they also understood that people who were emotionally or spiritually connected could influence each other's dream experiences through what they called sympathetic dreaming. If you were closely bonded with someone through family relationships, friendship, shared experiences, or even shared fears, their dream experiences could contaminate your own unconscious mind and cause you to have similar visions during sleep. This concept of sympathetic dreaming provides a medieval explanation for nightmare, epidemics that's actually quite sophisticated from a modern psychological perspective. Medieval people understood that psychological trauma, anxiety, and fear could spread through social networks in ways that affected people's sleep experiences and unconscious mental processes. They just attributed this psychological contagion to supernatural forces rather than social and psychological mechanisms. The social structure of medieval communities created ideal conditions for nightmare epidemics to develop and spread. Villages were tight-knit, isolated communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, where social relationships were intense and all-encompassing, and where individual psychological problems automatically became community concerns. When one person started having dramatic nightmares, the entire community would hear about it in detail, discuss it extensively, and collectively worry about what the dreams might mean for everyone's spiritual and physical safety. This intensive social sharing of dream content created feedback loops where people's anxiety about someone else's nightmares would generate their own disturbing sleep experiences, which would then be shared with the community and contribute to collective psychological distress that made everyone more susceptible to nightmare contagion. Medieval communities were essentially psychological echo chambers where individual trauma could reverberate and amplify until it affected entire populations. Medieval medicine understood that the mind and body were interconnected in ways that modern medicine is only beginning to appreciate fully. They recognized that emotional distress could cause physical symptoms, that physical ailments could trigger mental disturbances, and that social problems could manifest as both psychological and physiological disorders that affected entire communities simultaneously. This holistic approach meant that medieval physicians took nightmare epidemics seriously as both spiritual and medical phenomena that required comprehensive treatment addressing supernatural, psychological, social, and physical factors simultaneously. They understood that you couldn't treat individual psychological problems without also addressing the community dynamics and spiritual environment that were contributing to the collective distress. Medieval physicians also recognized that nightmare epidemics often coincided with periods of social stress, economic hardship, political instability, or spiritual crisis that created community-wide anxiety and psychological vulnerability. They understood that communities under pressure were more susceptible to collective psychological disturbances, and that addressing the underlying social problems was often necessary to resolve individual psychological symptoms. This sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual and collective psychology explains why medieval nightmare epidemics were often resolved through community-wide interventions like religious ceremonies, social reforms, or collective responses to underlying stressors rather than individual psychological treatment. The role of nutrition in medieval nightmare epidemics cannot be overstated, and this is where medieval medicine was actually more advanced than modern medicine in some ways. Medieval physicians understood that food could directly affect mental states, that certain substances could cause hallucinations and psychological disturbances, and that nutritional deficiencies could trigger symptoms that were indistinguishable from supernatural phenomena. Ergot contamination was common in rye-based foods throughout medieval Europe, creating widespread hallucinogenic effects that medieval people couldn't distinguish from spiritual visions or supernatural experiences. The ergot fungus produces compounds that are chemically similar to LSD, causing vivid hallucinations, altered states of consciousness, and psychological experiences that seem absolutely real to the people experiencing them. But medieval people had no way of understanding that their food was contaminated with psychoactive compounds. When entire communities started experiencing shared visions, collective hallucinations, and synchronized psychological disturbances after eating contaminated grain, the obvious explanation was supernatural intervention rather than chemical poisoning. The seasonal patterns of ergot contamination meant that nightmare epidemics often occurred during specific times of the year when contaminated grain was being consumed, creating apparent correlations between nightmare outbreaks and astronomical events, religious holidays, or seasonal changes that reinforced supernatural interpretations of psychological phenomena. Malnutrition was also endemic throughout medieval Europe, leading to neurological symptoms, cognitive impairments, and psychological disturbances that were routinely interpreted as supernatural phenomena. Protein deficiency, vitamin deficiencies, and chronic hunger all create symptoms that can include hallucinations, altered consciousness, and psychological experiences that seem supernatural to people who don't understand the relationship between nutrition and brain function. Medieval communities experiencing widespread malnutrition would often develop collective, psychological symptoms that appeared to be spiritual or supernatural in origin but were actually caused by the neurological effects of inadequate nutrition on brain chemistry and cognitive function. Sleep patterns in medieval times were also radically different from modern sleep in ways that made nightmare epidemics more likely and more intense. Before artificial lighting, people experienced much longer periods of darkness, leading to segmented sleep patterns with natural waking periods in the middle of the night that created opportunities for shared psychological experiences and collective nightmare episodes. Medieval people typically slept in two distinct phases, separated by a period of wakeful activity that could last for several hours. During these midnight wakeful periods, people would engage in social activities, religious observances, and community interactions that created opportunities for sharing dream content, discussing supernatural experiences, and collectively processing psychological material that had emerged during the first sleep phase. These segmented sleep patterns meant that nightmare experiences often occurred during the liminal periods between sleep and waking, when consciousness was partially activated but still influenced by dream content and unconscious psychological processes. This created ideal conditions for nightmare epidemics to develop and spread through communities that were simultaneously experiencing individual psychological disturbances and collective social processing of supernatural content. The medieval concept of incubus, the nightmare demon, was based on surprisingly accurate observations of what we now call sleep paralysis. But their understanding of the phenomenon was actually more sophisticated than modern medical explanations in some ways. Medieval physicians correctly identified the paralysis, the sense of being crushed, the terrifying visions, and the feeling of supernatural presence that accompany sleep paralysis episodes. But they also understood that incubus experiences were more likely to occur during periods of stress, anxiety, and social tension, that they could spread through communities where multiple people were experiencing similar psychological pressures, and that they often coincided with other types of supernatural experiences that suggested broader spiritual or psychological disturbances affecting entire communities. Modern medicine treats sleep paralysis as an individual neurological phenomenon, but medieval physicians understood it as a community-level psychological disturbance that required collective intervention and social support to resolve effectively. Their approach was actually more comprehensive and often more effective than modern individual treatment methods. Religious practices in medieval communities also contributed to nightmare epidemics in ways that medieval people couldn't recognize, but that are obvious from a modern psychological perspective. Medieval Christianity emphasized the reality of demonic forces, the constant spiritual warfare between good and evil, and the vulnerability of human souls to supernatural attack during sleep and other periods of reduced conscious control. This theological framework primed people to interpret unusual sleep experiences as supernatural attacks rather than psychological phenomena, creating a feedback loop where religious fear intensified nightmare experiences, which reinforced religious beliefs about demonic activity, which made people more susceptible to future nightmare episodes. Medieval religious practices also included extensive meditation on themes of death, judgment, hell, and spiritual danger that could trigger anxiety and psychological distress that manifested as nightmare experiences. Religious art, literature, and ceremony constantly exposed people to vivid imagery of supernatural terror that provided content for disturbing dreams and unconscious psychological experiences. The medieval emphasis on confession, examination of conscience, and constant self-monitoring for signs of sin created psychological conditions that were conducive to anxiety, guilt, and self-doubt that could manifest as nightmare experiences involving themes of divine punishment, demonic temptation, and spiritual failure. Medieval justice systems sometimes relied on dream interpretation for legal decisions, creating social conditions where nightmare experiences could have real-world consequences that intensified their psychological impact. If someone had a prophetic dream about a crime, it could be taken as evidence in legal proceedings. If someone experienced supernatural visions during sleep, those experiences could affect their social status, legal standing, and community relationships. This legal recognition of dream content as potentially factual information created enormous social pressure around nightmare experiences and made them much more psychologically significant than modern dreams. People couldn't dismiss disturbing sleep experiences as just dreams because those experiences might have legal, social, or spiritual consequences that affected their real-world safety and well-being. What's fascinating is that modern sleep science is beginning to validate some medieval observations about nightmare epidemics that were dismissed as superstition for centuries. We now know that psychological trauma can be contagious, that communities can share PTSD-like symptoms, that sleep disorders can spread through social groups, and that collective anxiety can trigger widespread psychological phenomena that affect entire populations simultaneously. Medieval people were observing real psychological and neurological phenomena, but they were interpreting them through their own cultural and religious framework that attributed these experiences to supernatural forces rather than natural psychological processes. Their observations were often accurate, but their explanations were based on the best available knowledge of their time rather than modern scientific understanding. The decline of nightmare epidemics in the post-medieval period coincides with several factors that modern psychology can identify and analyze. Improved nutrition reduced ergot poisoning and malnutrition-related neurological symptoms that had contributed to collective hallucinations and psychological disturbances. Artificial lighting changed sleep patterns and reduced the segmented sleep cycles that had created opportunities for shared nightmare experiences. The Protestant Reformation reduced emphasis on demonic supernatural activity and shifted religious focus away from the constant spiritual warfare themes that had contributed to anxiety and nightmare experiences. The rise of scientific medicine provided alternative explanations for sleep disorders and psychological phenomena that reduced supernatural interpretations and the social amplification of individual psychological problems. But perhaps most importantly, the shift from tight-knit village communities to more individualistic urban societies reduced the social transmission pathways that had allowed nightmare epidemics to spread through medieval communities. When you don't know your neighbors intimately, when social relationships are more superficial and compartmentalized, When individual psychological problems aren't automatically treated as community concerns, the conditions that create nightmare epidemics simply don't exist. Modern urban societies have developed psychological and social mechanisms that contain individual psychological disturbances and prevent them from spreading through communities as collective phenomena. We have professional mental health services, individual privacy protections, and social structures that limit the extent to which one person's psychological problems can affect entire communities. But we've also lost some of the community support systems and collective coping mechanisms that helped medieval communities eventually resolve nightmare epidemics through collective action and social solidarity. Modern societies are better at preventing psychological contagion, but they're often less effective at providing community-based support for people experiencing individual psychological distress. The most important insight from medieval nightmare epidemics is the recognition that the sleeping mind is far more complex, more socially connected, and more psychologically powerful than most modern people understand. Medieval people recognized that sleep experiences could have profound effects on waking consciousness, that individual psychological phenomena could become collective social experiences, and that unconscious mental processes were capable of sophisticated information processing and social interaction. These insights remain relevant for understanding modern psychological phenomena like mass hysteria, collective trauma, social media-driven psychological contagion, and the ways that individual mental health problems can spread through communities and social networks in contemporary societies. Medieval nightmare epidemics remind us that the boundary between individual and collective psychology is much more permeable than modern societies typically acknowledge, and that sleep, dreams, and unconscious mental processes continue to play important roles in social dynamics and collective psychological health that we're only beginning to understand through modern neuroscience and social psychology. When we dismiss medieval nightmare epidemics as superstition or primitive psychology, we miss important insights about human consciousness, social connection, and the ways that individual psychological experiences can become collective social phenomena under the right conditions. These historical cases provide valuable information about the full range of human psychological capabilities and the social factors that can either trigger or prevent collective psychological disturbances in any era. Let me share some of the most obscure and honestly disturbing facts about medieval nightmare epidemics that most historians prefer to leave buried in dusty archives. These are the details that didn't make it into the main stories, the fragments of information that are too strange, too unsettling, too perfectly preserved to be anything other than genuine historical records of experiences that challenge everything we think we know about the boundaries between sleep and waking reality. First obscure fact, and this one will make you grateful for modern privacy laws. There were professional dream watchers in some medieval communities. These weren't just concerned family members or religious authorities keeping an eye on troubled sleepers. We're talking about specialized professionals whose entire livelihood depended on their ability to monitor, interpret, and intervene in other people's sleep experiences during the most vulnerable hours of the night. The dream watchers were hired by wealthy families, religious institutions, and even entire communities that had been affected by nightmare epidemics or supernatural sleep disturbances. These professionals had developed sophisticated techniques for observing sleepers, without disturbing their natural sleep cycles, recognizing the subtle physical signs that indicated different types of dream experiences, and determining the optimal moments for intervention to prevent psychological or spiritual damage. Master Gregory the Dream Watcher, whose services were retained by several noble families in 13th century England, kept detailed logs of sleep behaviors that read like something out of a modern sleep laboratory. Except the observations were interpreted through medieval supernatural frameworks that treated every sleep disturbance as a potential spiritual crisis requiring immediate professional intervention. Gregory's logs, preserved in the private archives of the Pembroke family, describe a level of sleep monitoring that was both scientifically sophisticated and completely invasive by modern standards. He would position himself in sleepers' bedchambers and observe their breathing patterns, facial expressions, body movements, and vocalizations throughout the night, recording detailed notes about the progression of their sleep experiences and the supernatural forces that seem to be affecting their unconscious minds. But Gregory's observations went far beyond simple sleep monitoring. He claimed to be able to determine the spiritual content of people's dreams by watching their physical responses, identifying when sleepers were experiencing divine visions versus demonic temptations, and predicting which sleep experiences would have lasting psychological or spiritual effects on the dreamers. The Dream Watchers developed elaborate protocols for intervention that were based on their understanding of the spiritual dangers associated with different types of nightmare experiences. They knew exactly when to wake someone immediately to prevent spiritual contamination, when to let nightmares run their course because the suffering was spiritually beneficial, and when to perform protective rituals around sleeping individuals to shield them from supernatural attack. The most disturbing aspect of professional dream watching was the claim that experienced practitioners could somehow observe the content of other people's dreams through careful analysis of their physical responses during sleep. Master Gregory's logs include detailed descriptions of sleepers' dream narratives that he claimed to have determined purely through external observation, without any input from the dreamers themselves. One of Gregory's most famous cases involved Lady Margaret de Clare, whose recurring nightmares about being pursued by demonic horsemen were allegedly diagnosed and treated entirely through dream-watching techniques. Gregory claimed that he could observe the exact moments when the demonic horsemen appeared in Lady Margaret's dreams, track their movements through her sleeping mind, and even predict what actions the supernatural entities would take next based on subtle changes in her breathing and facial expressions. But the Dream Watchers' interventions weren't limited to simple observation and awakening procedures. They performed complex protective rituals around sleeping individuals, including the arrangement of religious artifacts, the burning of specific herbs, and the recitation of prayers designed to create spiritual barriers against supernatural attack during sleep. Some Dream Watchers claimed to be able to enter sleepers' dream spiritually and engage in supernatural combat with demonic forces that were threatening their clients' souls. Brother Thomas of Durham, a Benedictine monk who served as a dream watcher for his religious community, developed techniques for what he called sympathetic dreaming, the ability to synchronize his own sleep experiences with those of the people he was monitoring, allowing him to observe their dream content from within their unconscious experiences rather than from external physical observation. According to Brother Thomas's accounts, sympathetic dreaming required extensive spiritual preparation, including fasting, prayer, and meditation designed to create the psychological conditions necessary for shared unconscious experiences. The dream watcher would enter a state of controlled sleep that allowed his consciousness to merge with the sleeper's dream experience while maintaining enough awareness to intervene if spiritual dangers were encountered. The sympathetic dreaming technique was extremely dangerous for the dream watchers themselves, because it exposed them to whatever supernatural forces were affecting their clients' sleep experiences. Brother Thomas reported several cases where he became trapped in other people's nightmares and had to be awakened by assistant dream watchers who were monitoring his own sleep behavior during his sympathetic dreaming sessions. The economic aspects of professional dream watching were surprisingly sophisticated, with different levels of service available depending on clients' needs and financial resources. Basic dream watching involved overnight observation and simple intervention techniques, while premium services included sympathetic dreaming, ongoing spiritual protection, and detailed analysis of dream content for prophetic or spiritual significance. The most expensive dream watching services included what was called dream landscaping, the creation of customized sleeping environments designed to promote specific types of beneficial dream experiences while preventing unwanted supernatural intrusions. Dream landscapers would arrange bedchambers according to complex spiritual and psychological principles, using combinations of religious artifacts, natural materials, astronomical alignments, and acoustic conditions to optimize their clients' sleep experiences. Master William the Dream Landscaper, who served wealthy merchants in 14th century London, created sleeping environments that were so elaborate and expensive that they represented significant financial investments, comparable to purchasing property or luxury goods. His custom dream chambers included precisely positioned mirrors to deflect demonic influences, specially consecrated tapestries to promote divine visions, and hidden compartments containing protective amulets that were activated through complex ritual procedures. But the dream landscaping industry was also vulnerable to charlatans and fraudulent practitioners who exploited clients' fears about supernatural sleep experiences without providing any genuine protection or benefit. Several legal cases from medieval courts involved disputes between clients and dream landscapers over the effectiveness of expensive protective installations that failed to prevent nightmare experiences or supernatural attacks. The guild system that developed around professional dream watching included apprenticeship programs, professional standards, and certification procedures designed to ensure that dream watchers possessed genuine skills rather than simply exploiting public anxiety about supernatural sleep phenomena. Master dream watchers were required to demonstrate their abilities through practical examinations that included observing volunteer sleepers and accurately reporting their dream experiences without any input from the dreamers themselves. The decline of professional dream watching coincided with changes in medieval society that reduced demand for supernatural sleep monitoring services. As communities became larger and more anonymous, as religious emphasis shifted away from constant supernatural vigilance, and as scientific explanations for sleep phenomena became more widely accepted, the market for professional dream watching gradually disappeared. But the detailed records left by medieval dream watchers provide modern sleep researchers with invaluable information about historical sleep patterns, dream experiences, and the social factors that affected people's unconscious mental processes. Their observations about the relationship between physical sleep behaviors and dream content, their documentation of collective nightmare phenomena, and their techniques for sleep intervention offer insights that remain relevant for contemporary understanding of sleep disorders and unconscious psychological processes. Second obscure fact. And this one is genuinely disturbing from any modern ethical perspective. Some medieval communities practiced deliberate nightmare inoculation. This wasn't some primitive medical procedure or religious ritual. We're talking about systematic psychological experimentation where healthy individuals were intentionally exposed to nightmare experiences and supernatural sleep disturbances in hopes of building immunity to the psychological contagion that was spreading through their communities. The nightmare inoculation procedures were based on medieval medical theories that treated psychological disturbances as infectious diseases that could be prevented through controlled exposure to weakened versions of the psychological pathogens. Just as physicians were beginning to understand that exposure to mild forms of physical diseases could provide protection against more serious infections, some communities applied similar logic to nightmare epidemics and supernatural sleep disturbances. The village of Little Wickshire in 14th century England developed the most sophisticated nightmare inoculation program documented in medieval records. When neighboring communities began experiencing nightmare epidemics that were destroying social cohesion and economic productivity, Little Wickshire's leaders decided to take preemptive action by exposing their own population to controlled nightmare experiences before the psychological contagion could spread naturally to their community. Master Robert the physician, who supervised Little Wickshire's nightmare inoculation program, developed detailed protocols for exposing healthy individuals to supernatural sleep disturbances in ways that were designed to trigger mild psychological symptoms without causing the severe social disruption associated with full nightmare epidemics. His procedures involved having unaffected people sleep in the same rooms as nightmare sufferers, listen to detailed descriptions of supernatural dream content, and participate in guided visualization exercises designed to simulate nightmare experiences. The inoculation sessions were conducted in carefully controlled environments with medical and religious supervision to ensure that participants didn't experience psychological damage from their exposure to nightmare content. Master Robert believed that controlled exposure to supernatural sleep disturbances would allow people's minds to develop natural defenses against more serious psychological contagion, The initial results seemed promising. People who underwent nightmare inoculation reported experiencing mild sleep disturbances and unsettling dreams, but they didn't develop the severe psychological symptoms or social dysfunction associated with full nightmare epidemics. The inoculated individuals seemed to be able to experience supernatural sleep phenomena without being overwhelmed by them. But the nightmare inoculation program began to have unintended consequences as the control. Exposure sessions became more intense and sophisticated. Some participants who were supposed to experience only mild psychological symptoms developed severe nightmare disorders that were indistinguishable from natural nightmare epidemic cases. Others became psychologically addicted to the supernatural experiences and demanded increasingly intense inoculation sessions to satisfy their craving for supernatural sleep phenomena. Brother Marcus, a visiting Franciscan monk who observed Little Wixer's nightmare inoculation program, reported that the controlled exposure sessions had essentially created an artificial nightmare epidemic that was more intense and more difficult to resolve than the natural psychological contagion the community had been trying to prevent. The inoculation procedures had backfired completely, transforming a healthy community into a population of people who were actively seeking out supernatural sleep disturbances. The most disturbing aspect of the nightmare inoculation program was the discovery that psychological immunity to supernatural sleep phenomena was temporary and required regular booster treatments to maintain effectiveness. People who had been successfully inoculated against nightmare experiences would gradually lose their resistance over time, becoming even more susceptible to psychological contagion than they had been before their initial inoculation. This meant that communities practicing nightmare inoculation became trapped in cycles of ongoing psychological experimentation, where they had to continuously expose their populations to supernatural sleep disturbances to maintain immunity against natural nightmare epidemics. The cure had become worse than the disease, creating permanent psychological instability that affected entire communities for generations. The family-based nightmare inoculation procedures were particularly controversial and ethically problematic. Some families would systematically expose their children to supernatural sleep content and nightmare experiences, believing that early inoculation would provide lifelong protection against psychological contagion. These procedures involved having children sleep with adults who were experiencing nightmare episodes, exposing them to detailed accounts of supernatural dreams, and encouraging them to seek out frightening sleep experiences. The psychological damage caused by family-based nightmare inoculation was severe and long-lasting. Children who underwent these procedures often developed chronic anxiety, sleep disorders, and psychological problems that persisted into adulthood. Many became unable to experience normal, peaceful sleep because they had been trained from childhood to expect supernatural disturbances and psychological trauma during sleep. The community-wide nightmare inoculation programs also created social divisions between inoculated and non-inoculated populations that generated conflict and discrimination. People who had undergone nightmare inoculation often viewed themselves as spiritually and psychologically superior to those who hadn't been exposed to supernatural sleep experiences. Non-inoculated individuals were sometimes treated as socially inferior or spiritually weak because they hadn't proven their ability to survive psychological contagion. The religious authorities' response to nightmare inoculation was generally negative, with most church officials arguing that deliberately exposing people to supernatural sleep disturbances was spiritually dangerous regardless of any potential medical benefits. They argued that nightmare inoculation represented a form of trafficking with demonic forces that could compromise people's souls even if it provided temporary protection against psychological contagion. The theological debates about nightmare inoculation centered on whether it was morally acceptable to expose people to spiritual dangers in hopes of building resistance to worse spiritual threats. Some theologians argued that nightmare inoculation was similar to other forms of medical treatment that involved controlled exposure to harmful substances for therapeutic purposes. Others maintained that supernatural sleep phenomena were fundamentally different from physical diseases and that any deliberate contact with such forces was inherently corrupting. The legal implications of nightmare inoculation were also complex and controversial. If someone was psychologically damaged during inoculation procedures, who was responsible for the harm? If inoculated individuals became psychologically addicted to supernatural experiences and caused social problems, could the community hold the inoculation administrators legally liable? If children were subjected to nightmare inoculation without their consent and suffered lasting psychological damage, what legal remedies were available? Several court cases involving nightmare inoculation established legal precedents that remained influential in medieval law for centuries. The case of Master William versus the village of Little Wickshire established that communities could be held financially responsible for psychological damage caused by experimental medical procedures, even if those procedures were intended to provide public health benefits. The long-term social consequences of nightmare inoculation affected medieval communities for generations after the initial experimental programs had ended. Communities that had practiced nightmare inoculation often developed cultural traditions around supernatural sleep experiences that normalized psychological disturbances and made future nightmare epidemics more likely to occur and more difficult to resolve. The documentation of nightmare inoculation procedures provides modern researchers with disturbing insights into medieval understanding of psychological contagion and community responses to collective mental health crises. The detailed records of these experimental programs reveal sophisticated understanding of psychological transmission mechanisms, combined with complete lack of ethical oversight that resulted in widespread psychological harm. The failure of nightmare inoculation programs demonstrates the dangers of applying medical models to psychological phenomena without understanding the complex social and spiritual factors that contribute to collective mental health. The medieval experiments with controlled exposure to supernatural sleep disturbances created more psychological problems than they solved, establishing patterns of community psychological dysfunction that persisted long after the original nightmare epidemics had ended. Third obscure fact. And this one reveals just how sophisticated medieval understanding of nightmare phenomena actually was. Medieval nightmare epidemics had their own specialized vocabulary that has been completely lost to modern language. We're not talking about a few archaic terms scattered through old texts. This was an entire linguistic system with hundreds of specific words and phrases designed to describe precise aspects of supernatural sleep experiences that medieval people encountered regularly enough to require detailed terminology. The complexity and precision of medieval nightmare vocabulary suggests that these psychological phenomena were far more common, more varied, and more socially significant than modern historians have generally recognized. You don't develop elaborate specialized terminology for rare or isolated events. You develop it for experiences that are frequent enough, important enough, and complex enough to require precise communication about subtle distinctions and specific characteristics. Margrama in Old Norse described the specific type of exhaustion that followed shared nightmare experiences, not just ordinary tiredness from poor sleep, but a particular form of psychological and physical depletion that occurred when multiple people in a community experienced synchronized supernatural sleep disturbances. The term implied both individual fatigue and collective emotional drainage that affected entire social groups simultaneously. Medieval Norse communities understood that Mardremut was contagious in its own right, that the exhaustion caused by shared nightmare experiences could spread through communities even faster than the original nightmare content, creating cascading psychological effects where people became too depleted to cope with normal daily activities or resist additional supernatural sleep disturbances. Phantasmicus morbus in medieval Latin referred to the physical symptoms that accompanied psychological dream contagion, not just the mental or emotional effects of nightmare epidemics, but the actual bodily changes that occurred when people were exposed to supernatural sleep phenomena. This included specific types of fever, skin conditions, digestive problems, and neurological symptoms that medieval physicians recognized as distinct from other forms of illness. The use of morbus, disease, in this context indicates that medieval medical professionals understood nightmare contagion as a genuine pathological condition that required medical treatment rather than just spiritual intervention. They had observed consistent patterns of physical symptoms that accompanied psychological dream disturbances and had developed specific medical terminology to describe these psychosomatic manifestations. Somnium pestis literally translates as dream plague, but the medieval usage was much more specific than a simple metaphor comparing nightmares to infectious diseases. This term described the precise mechanisms through which nightmare experiences would spread through communities, including the social transmission pathways, the incubation periods, and the progression patterns that medieval observers had documented in multiple epidemic cases. Medieval physicians who used the term somnium pestis understood that dream contagion followed predictable epidemiological patterns similar to physical diseases, with identifiable patient zero cases, clear transmission routes through social networks, and characteristic progression patterns that allowed medical professionals to predict how nightmare epidemics would develop and spread through affected communities. The linguistic precision of these terms suggests that medieval people were making careful observational distinctions between different types of supernatural sleep phenomena that modern psychology has only recently begun to recognize. They weren't just lumping all sleep disturbances together as bad dreams. They were identifying specific subcategories of nightmare experiences that had distinct characteristics, different transmission mechanisms, and varied social consequences. Nocturnal spiritual warfare vocabulary included dozens of terms for specific types of supernatural entities that appeared in dreams, different categories of spiritual attacks that occurred during sleep, and various defensive techniques that could be used to protect against supernatural sleep disturbances. This wasn't just religious rhetoric. It was technical terminology for psychological phenomena that medieval people encountered, frequently enough to require precise descriptive language. Terms like succubus vigilans, waking succubus, described sleep paralysis experiences where the supernatural entity appeared to remain present after the sleeper regained consciousness. Demon recursivus, recurring demon, referred to nightmare figures that appeared in multiple sleep episodes with consistent characteristics. And phantasma communicatum, shared phantom, described supernatural entities that appeared to multiple dreamers simultaneously. The sophistication of this supernatural sleep vocabulary indicates that medieval people were making careful distinctions between different types of psychological experiences that modern science is only beginning to understand. Their terminology reveals observational accuracy about sleep, phenomena that was far more advanced than their theoretical explanations for what was causing these experiences. Dream injury terminology included specific words for psychological damage caused by supernatural sleep experiences, terms that distinguished between temporary psychological distress and permanent mental changes that resulted from severe nightmare encounters. Medieval people understood that some dream experiences could cause lasting psychological harm that was qualitatively different from normal emotional responses to frightening dreams. Anima fractura, soul fracture, described the specific type of psychological damage that occurred when someone's core sense of identity was altered by supernatural dream experiences. Memoria phantasmica, phantom memory, referred to dream content that became so vivid and persistent that it interfered with recollection of actual events. And voluntas disrupta, disrupted will, described the loss of normal decision-making capability that could result from severe nightmare trauma. These terms reveal medieval understanding of psychological concepts that weren't formally recognized by academic psychology until the 20th century. Medieval people had observed and named psychological phenomena like dissociation, false memory implantation, and trauma-induced decision-making impairment centuries before these concepts became part of professional psychological vocabulary. Collective dreaming terminology included words for different types of shared dream experiences that medieval communities encountered during nightmare epidemics. These terms distinguished between dreams that multiple people had about the same subject matter, dreams where people appeared to experience the same events from different perspectives, and dreams where multiple dreamers seemed to interact with each other within shared unconscious experiences. Somnium convergendum described situations where people who had no contact with each other would have nearly identical dreams about specific events or locations. Visio multiplex referred to cases where several people would dream about the same event but from different viewpoints that could be combined to create detailed accounts of dream narratives. And communicatio nocturnalis described instances where dreamers seemed to have conversations or interactions with each other during shared sleep experiences. The existence of specific terminology for these phenomena suggests that shared dreaming experiences were common, enough during medieval nightmare epidemics to require precise descriptive language for communication between medical professionals, religious authorities, and affected communities. Medieval people weren't just reporting occasional instances of similar dreams. They were documenting systematic patterns of collective unconscious experience that required technical vocabulary for accurate description. Temporal displacement terminology included words for nightmare, experiences that seemed to involve knowledge of past or future events that the dreamers couldn't have acquired through normal means. Medieval people had observed that supernatural sleep experiences often included information about distant events, historical occurrences, or future developments that proved to be accurate despite the dreamer's lack of access to such information through conventional channels. Prophetic precision vocabulary distinguished between different types of future knowledge that appeared in dreams, including visio certa, certain vision, for predictions that proved completely accurate, visio partialis, partial vision, for prophecies that were partially correct but included inaccurate details, and visio symbolica, symbolic vision, for prophetic dreams that required interpretation to understand their predictive significance. The systematic nature of medieval prophetic dream terminology indicates that future knowledge in dreams was common enough to require precise classification systems for different types of temporal displacement experiences. Medieval people weren't just occasionally reporting dreams that seemed prophetic. They were documenting consistent patterns of supernatural temporal access that required technical vocabulary for medical and religious analysis. The loss of this specialized nightmare vocabulary represents a significant gap in modern understanding of historical sleep phenomena and psychological experiences. When the linguistic tools for describing specific types of supernatural sleep disturbances disappeared from common usage, the ability to recognize and analyze these phenomena also diminished, creating historical amnesia about psychological capabilities and experiences that were once well documented and carefully studied. Modern sleep research is rediscovering some of the psychological phenomena that medieval nightmare vocabulary described, but we're doing so without the benefit of the precise observational distinctions and technical terminology that medieval people developed through centuries of careful documentation of supernatural sleep experiences. We're essentially reinventing concepts and rediscovering psychological capabilities that were once common knowledge, but were lost when the specialized vocabulary for describing them fell out of use. The medieval nightmare vocabulary reveals that our ancestors possessed sophisticated understanding of psychological phenomena that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Their linguistic precision about supernatural sleep experiences demonstrates observational accuracy and conceptual sophistication that challenges contemporary assumptions about the primitive nature of medieval psychology and the superiority of modern scientific understanding of consciousness and sleep phenomena. If you're somehow still awake, which I doubt, you've just experienced 2 hours of the most bizarre nightmare epidemics in human history. And if you manage to drift off somewhere between dancing plagues and demon-infested dreams, well, that was exactly the point. But here's what I find genuinely unsettling about these stories. They remind us that the line between individual experience and collective reality, if you're somehow still awake, which I doubt, you've just experienced 2 hours of the most bizarre nightmare epidemics in human history. And if you manage to drift off somewhere between dancing plagues and demon-infested dreams, well, that was exactly the point. But here's what I find genuinely unsettling about these stories. They remind us that the line between individual experience and collective reality is much thinner than we like to believe. When entire communities can share the same nightmares, when dreams can spread like diseases, when sleep itself becomes dangerous, you realize that consciousness isn't as private or protected as we assume. Medieval people lived in a world where dreams mattered, where nightmares had consequences, where sleep was genuinely risky. We've traded that supernatural terror for different kinds of anxiety, but maybe we've also lost some understanding of how interconnected our mental lives really are. So let me know in the comments where you're listening from and whether you've ever experienced anything like shared dreams or nightmare contagion. Have you ever had the same dream as someone else or felt like your sleep was somehow contaminated by someone else's fears? And if you enjoyed this journey through medieval nightmare epidemics, there are plenty more bizarre sleep stories waiting in the archive. From Roman dream temples to Victorian sleep experiments to modern sleep paralysis epidemics, the history of nightmares is stranger than fiction. Sweet dreams, folks, and remember, in the medieval world, nightmares weren't just personal experiences, they were community events. See you in your dreams, assuming they're your own.